Tonight, you drift into a world where silence speaks louder than any voice. Close your eyes and imagine the faint glow of firelight in the distance. Not fierce, not consuming, but steady, like the heartbeat of an ancient world. Across the earth, countless civilizations once gathered in twilight hours to honor their dead, not with fear, but with reverence. Funeral rituals were not only moments of loss, but moments of connection between the living and the departed, between the body and the soul, between earth and sky. In the stillness of ritual, people whispered to eternity, believing their words could carry across unseen rivers and into lands beyond life. As you rest, allow yourself to be guided into these forgotten ceremonies, each one a gentle unfolding of belief, an echo of humanity's desire to honor the mystery of what comes after breath. You need not analyze, you need not search. Simply listen as if you were present in the sacred silence itself. A witness to fires long extinguished, chants long faded, and prayers that still float like soft ash upon the wind. Here, in this quiet space, you are safe. You are resting within the timeless hush of ancient ritual. Chapter 1: Egypt's Eternal Horizon. Funerary Rites of the Nile. The people of ancient Egypt lived with a deep awareness of death, yet they did not see it as an ending. To them, death was a crossing, a transition from one form of existence into another. The Nile, with its steady rhythm of flooding and retreat, taught them this truth year after year. What appears to die returns again, reshaped and renewed. Just as the river carried fertile silt to renew the land, the Egyptians believed the rituals of burial carried the soul into a horizon beyond sight. Funerary rites in this world were not casual or secondary. They were maps, carefully drawn with gestures, words, and offerings meant to guide the departed through invisible terrain. Every act, from washing the body to the final sealing of the tomb, was thought to hold spiritual weight. Without these steps, the soul could falter, becoming lost or vulnerable in the shadowed landscapes of the afterlife. Mummification stood at the heart of these preparations. The preservation of the body was not simply an act of reverence. It was a statement of belief that the soul required a home, even beyond death. The body, known as the cut, was more than discarded flesh. It was the anchor through which the ka, the vital essence, might continue to exist. By drying, wrapping, and protecting it, the embalmers offered stability in a realm of transition. The process itself stretched over 70 days. First, the body was cleansed, the internal organs removed and stored in canopic jars, each guarded by a divine figure. The liver, lungs, stomach, and intestines were set aside with care, under the protection of the 4 sons of Horus. The heart, however, was often left in place, for it was believed to be the center of memory and conscience, the very thing that would be weighed in judgment before Osiris. The brain, paradoxically, was usually discarded. Thought, in Egyptian belief, was not seated in the head but in the heart. After purification, the body was dried with natron, a natural salt gathered from desert lakes. This long drying period ensured preservation against decay. The skin was later oiled, perfumed, and wrapped in layer after layer of linen. Amulets were tucked between the wrappings. The eye of Horus, the scarab beetle, small charms of stone or faience, each with a specific protective role. To bind the body was to bind it against harm, both physical and spiritual. The rituals extended beyond the body itself. Surrounding the dead were objects chosen with care: food, drink, furniture, tools, and ornaments. To modern eyes, these might seem like grave goods or symbols of wealth. To the Egyptians, they were necessities. The afterlife was not imagined as a formless drift, but as a continuation of life, transformed and eternal. The soul would eat, drink, and dwell in the field of reeds, a perfected version of Egypt's fertile land. To go unprovided was to risk hunger and need beyond the grave. Perhaps the most striking ritual of all was the opening of the mouth ceremony. Performed at the threshold of burial, it sought to reawaken the senses of the deceased. A priest, often dressed as Anubis, touched ritual instruments to the eyes, ears, and mouth of the mummy or statue. In doing so, he symbolically restored breath, speech, sight, and hearing. The faculties needed to live again in the other world. Without this ritual, the soul could not fully awaken beyond the horizon of death. Egyptian funerary texts, such as the pyramid texts, kofun texts, and eventually the Book of the Dead, acted as manuals for this passage. Inscribed on walls, coffins, or papyrus, they contained hymns, spells, and instructions. These texts were not mere incantations. They were navigational tools ensuring the soul could recognize threats, speak the right words before guardians, and claim its rightful place among the blessed. Central to this journey was the moment of judgment before Osiris, Lord of the underworld. In the Hall of Ma'at, the heart of the deceased was weighed against the feather of truth. If the heart was light, free of lies, cruelty, or disorder, the soul was granted passage into eternal peace. If heavy, it was devoured by Amit, a fearsome creature part, crocodile, lion, and hippopotamus. To the Egyptians, this was not eternal torment, but a second death, the annihilation of existence itself. It is striking to consider how much trust they placed in these rituals. Every act of preparation, every spoken word was not symbolic alone, but necessary. One could imagine the quiet concentration of the priests, the stillness of the embalming halls, the muffled steps within tomb corridors. In that silence, the Egyptians believed they were constructing eternity. Even the tomb itself was more than a resting place. It was a house for the afterlife, complete with painted walls showing fields, banquets, and offerings. These images were not decoration, but activation. To depict food was to create food in the other world. To show a boat was to ensure the deceased could sail upon eternal waters. The art of the tomb was part of the ritual fabric, extending life into the unseen. And yet, within all of this formality, one can sense a deeply human truth. Death was not something to be feared in silence. It was something to be prepared for, spoken to, and shaped. The Egyptians saw continuity where others might see rupture. To them, the act of burial was an act of hope, the belief that existence could carry on, if only the proper care was given, as you picture the dim chambers of a pyramid or the painted walls of a valley tomb. You might wonder how much of our own rituals today echo these ancient acts. We too place objects near our dead. We too speak words of remembrance, and we too hope, quietly, tenderly too, that those we love will find peace beyond what we can see. In this way, the silence of the Egyptian tomb was never empty. It was filled with expectation, with prayers carved into stone, with the hope that the journey into the eternal horizon was guided, steady, and complete. And though thousands of years have passed, that silence still speaks. It asks us softly, how do we prepare for the unknown, and what faith do we place in the journeys that begin where life ends? Chapter 2. The Silent Funeral Pyres of Ancient Varanasi. On the banks of the Ganges, the ancient city of Varanasi has stood for millennia, a place where life and death meet in sacred rhythm. For Hindus, this city is no ordinary ground, is a threshold believed to rest at the center of spiritual geography, where every ritual action carries the power to release the soul from the long cycles of birth and rebirth. To die in Varanasi and to be cremated on its riverfront ghats is considered one of the highest blessings, a final passage into liberation. The ritual of cremation is not abrupt, nor is it silent in its preparation. Families gather at the riverside, bringing with them the body of their loved one. The air is filled with low chanting, the repetition of mantras, and the muted sound of footsteps on stone steps leading down to the river. The body, wrapped in white cloth, is bathed in the waters of the Ganges before being placed upon the funeral pyre. White is the color of mourning in Hindu tradition, symbolizing purity and the return of the soul to its essential nature. The pyres are built with sandalwood or other woods, sometimes mixed with offerings of ghee or oils to help the fire burn steadily. Fire is not merely a practical tool here. It is divine. Agni, the fire god, is believed to be the messenger who carries the offerings of this world to the gods. In cremation, Agni becomes the one who delivers the soul itself, carrying it from its bodily form into the realm beyond. To watch a pyre burn is to witness a union of elements, earth, fire, water, and air, meeting in one final act of transformation. The ceremony is led by the eldest son or another close male relative who walks around the body, lighting the pyre, while reciting prayers. This act is not only ritual duty but a spiritual responsibility. It ensures that the body is given to the fire properly and that the soul can begin its passage toward moksha, release from the endless cycle of samsara, the births and rebirths that bind all beings to suffering. The burning itself can last several hours. The family waits nearby, listening to the crackle of wood and watching flames rise against the night. This is not silence in the ordinary sense. It is a quiet, filled with meaning, the subdued conversations of mourners, the steady rhythm of priests reciting verses, the occasional splash of water against stone steps. The atmosphere is heavy, yet it is not fearful. Death here is treated as part of the order of things, a truth as constant as the flowing river. The ashes, when the fire has done its work, are gathered and returned to the Ganges. In this act, body and soul are both entrusted to the sacred current. For Hindus, the Ganges is not merely water. It is Ganga herself, a goddess, descended from heaven to purify humankind, to rest in her embrace, even as ash is to be cleansed of worldly bonds and carried toward the eternal. This ritual is not only for the dead, it is for the living as well. To sit by the burning ghats of Varanasi is to be reminded of impermanence, to see clearly the truth that the body will one day return to the elements. Pilgrims and travelers often describe the experience not as frightening, but strangely calming. The flames rise and fade, yet the river continues, always flowing, always renewing. The cycle is visible, undeniable, and in that recognition comes a kind of peace. The belief in moksha gives the ritual its deeper meaning. For many, liberation is not gained in a single life. It may take countless births, countless struggles, to burn away ignorance and desire. Yet to die in Varanasi, with the Ganges carrying one's remains, is believed to bring a final release, sparing the soul from further return. This hope transforms grief into something gentler. Sorrow mixed with reverence, loss held within the promise of freedom. It is worth noting how the city itself becomes part of the ritual. The ghats, those wide stone steps descending into the river, are layered with centuries of memory. Fires have burned there without pause for generations. At Manikarnika Ghat, the most sacred of them all, flames are said never to be extinguished. Day and night, through rain and heat, the fire continues. This unbroken burning is seen as a reminder of eternity, a visible sign that the passage of souls never ceases. The philosophy behind these rituals is woven into Hindu scripture. Texts such as the Garuda Purana describe what happens to the soul after death, the trials it must face, and the importance of proper rites. Without cremation, without the prayers and offerings, the soul may linger, restless and unsettled. But with the rituals complete, the soul finds its path forward, led by the prayers of the living and the purifying force of fire and water. And yet, beyond all theological detail, there remains a silence that is felt rather than spoken. One can imagine sitting by the Ganges at night, hearing the faint crackle of distant pyres, the chanting of priests carried on the wind, and the steady murmur of the river. Life and death mingle there. The cries of children playing nearby, the flickering of flames, the sound of bells from a temple further upstream. All of it becomes part of one seamless fabric. You might wonder, in such a place, whether the boundary between the living and the dead is thinner than we usually imagine. Does the soul, as the scriptures say, rise beyond, freed into light? Or does it linger in the silence, in the smoke curling above the water, in the warmth of a flame that seems to carry more than heat? For the people who gather at the banks of the Ganges, there is little doubt. They trust the fire, the chants, and the river to do their work. They trust that their loved one has not been lost, but released, carried from the visible world into the unseen. And perhaps, as the embers fade and the ashes drift into the current, the living too find a kind of release from grief, from fear, from the restless questions that hover at the edge of every human life. The funeral pyres of Varanasi remain both ancient and present. Their smoke has risen for centuries, a reminder to all who watch that life is brief, the body fragile, but the soul is always on its way, moving with the current toward a horizon no eye can measure. Chapter 3. Greek Rituals of the Afterworld, Crossing the River Styx. In the imagination of the ancient Greeks, death was not an abrupt end. It was a transition, a crossing, a passage into another realm governed by myth, ritual, and philosophy. The body of the departed was not only laid to rest, but also prepared for a symbolic journey into Hades, the shadowy underworld where souls would dwell after leaving the light of the living world. The most iconic image of this journey was the river Styx. It was said to flow at the very boundary between the living and the dead. Souls who reached its dark waters faced a single challenge: to be ferried across by Charon, the boatman. His fee was simple but non-negotiable, a coin placed on the eyes or tongue of the deceased. Without it, the soul was condemned to wander restlessly along the riverbanks, never reaching its destination. This small ritual act of placing the coin reveals how deeply myth and daily practice intertwined. Archaeologists have uncovered burials across the Greek world where coins were carefully placed with the dead. It was not wealth that mattered, but the symbolic payment for safe passage. Even the poorest were provided with one, as if their families feared nothing more than the thought of their loved one left stranded, unheard, and unseen in the liminal space between life and death. The funeral rites themselves began long before. This journey was imagined. The body was washed, anointed, and dressed. Women of the household led the mourning, often wailing aloud, their voices carrying both grief and ritual function. The prothesis, or laying out of the body, allowed family and community to gather. They would sing, cry, and keep vigil through the night. To them, this was not only an expression of sorrow, but also a way of ensuring the dead were honored properly, so their soul might move forward in peace. From there, the ekphora followed, the solemn procession to the grave. The body was carried on a bier, often through the streets, sometimes accompanied by flute players. their notes weaving sorrow into the air. Neighbors and friends joined, walking slowly toward the tomb or pyre. For those left behind, this was both farewell and duty, a moment when the living fulfilled their responsibility to the dead. The burial or cremation sealed the body's fate, but the soul's journey was just beginning. Philosophy and myth overlapped here. In Homer's epics, the underworld appears as a shadowed place where souls linger with faint memories of life. Later writers, influenced by Orphic and Pythagorean traditions, began to imagine more complex destinies, rewards and punishments, cycles of rebirth, or even liberation from the endless wheel of existence. For some Greeks, death was not simply an end, but part of a greater cosmic pattern. At the heart of this passage remained Charon and his ferry. The image is simple. A small boat gliding across dark waters, a solitary figure poling the vessel, and the silent dead as passengers. Yet it carried immense symbolic weight. The coin placed with the deceased was not merely an offering, but a reminder of inevitability. Every soul, rich or poor, king or servant, would face this same river. In its waters, the distinctions of life dissolved. The Greeks also imagined layers of rivers encircling the underworld: Acheron, Phlegethon, Cocytus, and Lethe, each carrying unique meanings. Lethe, the river of forgetfulness, offered souls the chance to drink and erase the memory of life before rebirth. In contrast, some Orphic initiates sought to avoid Lethe, preferring instead to drink from Mnemosyne, the spring of memory, so they might retain knowledge through cycles of existence. Here, funerary rites reflected philosophical choices, a way of shaping the destiny of the soul through mythic geography. When we look at their tombs and offerings, we see a culture both practical and symbolic. Grave markers often bore simple inscriptions, a name, a farewell, sometimes a brief image of the deceased in everyday activity. Yet alongside these were painted vases depicting Charon himself, ferrying passengers across the Styx. Death was not only personal loss, but also part of a shared cultural vision. The dead were mourned, but their journey was imagined in vivid mythic terms. Why did the Greeks cling so strongly to this image of the ferryman and the coin? Perhaps it was a way of softening the terror of death, giving it structure, a ritual, script. In the quiet of the grave, a small token, one coin, carried immense hope. It said to the soul, "You will not be lost, you will be guided." There is something deeply human in this. Across many cultures, rites of passage mark birth, marriage, and death. Each reflects the belief that no great transition should be faced unprepared. The Greeks, with their blend of story and ritual, ensured that even in death, one did not walk alone. A coin, a chant, a procession. Each piece worked together as a map for the unknown, and so the silence of their graves was never empty. It was filled with echoes of myth, with the imagined sound of oars dipping into dark waters, with the belief that a loved one was crossing into eternity. The ferry, the river, and the coin were not simply mythic symbols. They were bridges between the living and the dead, between memory and mystery. Perhaps in thinking of these rites, one is invited to wonder if every culture creates its own map of the afterlife. What map do we hold within ourselves? And if the Styx were before you now, would you feel ready to step into the boat, coin in hand, trusting the silence of the journey ahead? Chapter 4. The Norse funeral fires beneath northern skies. The Norse understood death as both an ending and a beginning. For them, funerary rites were not only gestures of farewell, but also a way of ensuring the dead found their place in the unseen world. Beneath the wide skies of the north, where fjords cut into stone and the winds carried the scent of pine and sea, fire became the chosen element of release. The burning of a ship is perhaps the most enduring image. A body laid upon a vessel surrounded by goods, weapons, and offerings set alight so that flames consumed both wood and flesh before the whole sank into dark waters. Yet this practice, though deeply symbolic, was not as common as later legends suggest. Archaeology reveals many burials in the earth with or without cremation, but the ship itself, whether as vessel or as grave mound, remained the central image of passage. The ship was life's companion, and so it became death's companion as well. The Norse believed the dead needed tools for the journey ahead. In graves, archaeologists have found swords, shields, drinking horns, beads, and even entire animals. Horses were often sacrificed, their lives given so their master might ride into the next realm. To modern eyes, these objects are relics of ritual. To the Norse, they were practical necessities, provisions for a voyage beyond the horizon. For them, funeral itself was a community act. Songs were sung, often in the form of dirges that honored the courage of the departed. Skalds, the poets, sometimes composed verses of remembrance, ensuring that deeds in life would echo into memory. Courage was praised not only for warriors, but also for farmers, hunters, and seafarers. All lives carried weight in a culture where survival was hard and where death could arrive in winter frost or in battle alike. Silence, too, had its place. After the chanting, after the fire was lit, the community would often watch quietly as the flames rose against the northern night. The sound of crackling wood and rushing sea was itself a hymn, a reminder of both endings and mystery. What lay beyond Valhalla's gates, or in Hell's Hall, was never fully known. Fire carried the body away, but silence carried the question. Valhalla is often remembered as the warrior's paradise, a hall where chosen fighters joined Odin to feast and prepare for the final battle of Ragnarök. But not all souls were bound there. Many were thought to pass into Hell, the realm overseen by the goddess of the same name. This was not necessarily a place of torment, but rather a shadowy dwelling for those who died of age, sickness, or causes not tied to war. The Norse afterlife was not a single vision, but a branching tree of fates. The ship burial, in this sense, was not about one destination, but about readiness. To set fire to a ship was to trust the elements to carry the soul, fire, air, and water working together to transform what was once flesh into memory and spirit. Whether one believed in Valhalla, hell, or the halls of other gods, the fire ensured no soul was left untethered. Archaeological finds such as the Oseberg and Gokstad ships give a glimpse into the grandeur of some burials. Entire ships buried beneath, mounds filled with rich goods, carvings and textiles. The Oseberg burial contained 2 women, possibly of high rank, accompanied by ornate sleds, carts, and carved animal heads. Here, wealth and artistry became part of the funerary rite, a statement not only of status, but of cosmic preparation. These burials remind us that the Norse saw death as an extension of life's journey. One did not leave empty-handed nor unaccompanied. The role of women in funerary rites is also striking. Historical accounts describe women, sometimes seeresses, leading parts of the ritual, chanting, and making offerings. In Ibn Fadlan's famous account of a Viking funeral on the Volga, a slave girl volunteered to join her master in death. Though the description is stark and unsettling, it reveals the intensity with which some communities bound life and death together, seeing sacrifice as part of the sacred passage. And yet, alongside these acts of fire and ritual, there was tenderness. Grave goods often included small items, combs, spindle whorls, and tools of daily life. These gestures suggest remembrance not only of status or courage, but of the quiet rhythms of existence. The Norse did not separate the heroic from the ordinary. To live, to farm, to raise children, to endure winter, all were acts of value, honored in death with symbols of continuity. In the northern night, when the pyres' flames reflected upon fjord waters, the living saw more than fire. They saw a beacon, a guide. The blaze lit the sky for gods and humans alike, marking the passage of one soul into the unseen. For those gathered on the shore, it was both a farewell and a reminder. Death stood close to them all, as present as the sea and the snow. Why did they trust fire so deeply? Perhaps because it transformed. Fire takes what is heavy, bound to earth, and releases it upward, into air, into light. To watch a ship burn was to watch the soul unmoored, lifted beyond reach. The community grieved, yet they also believed the flame itself was carrying their loved one into a realm they could not follow. The Norse funerary fire, then, was never simply destruction. It was release, a ritual of transformation under the watch of gods and ancestors. In the smoke rising against the northern skies, they glimpsed a connection between worlds. For a brief moment, the horizon was not only sea and mountain, but a bridge into eternity. And so, whether in a burning ship drifting from the shore, or a mound rising from the earth, the Norse honored death with flame, silence, and song. Theirs was a faith both fierce and tender, shaped by hardship, by myth, and by wonder at what lay unseen. Perhaps the deeper mystery is this: when the last spark of the pyre faded, when the ship had sunk beneath the waves or the mound lay quiet. In snow, what did the soul truly encounter? Was it Odin's hall, Hell's embrace, or something beyond all stories? The flames carried the body away, but the question remained, flickering like fire beneath the vast northern skies. Chapter 5: Mesopotamian Tombs, Whispers of the Underworld. In the fertile crescent of Mesopotamia, where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers carved life into desert earth, some of humanity's earliest civilizations shaped their understanding of death. Here, in Sumer, Akkad, Babylon, and Assyria, funerary customs were both practical responses to the climate and profound expressions of spiritual belief. The tombs of Mesopotamia, whether humble graves or monumental chambers, were more than resting places. They were thresholds, quiet spaces where the living and the dead remained bound together. The Sumerians, among the earliest city builders, believed the soul continued after death, but not in paradise or torment. Instead, it journeyed to a shadowy underworld known as Kur or Irkala. This realm was described as dim, dusty, and without sunlight. There, the spirits of the dead, called Giddim, existed in a muted reflection of their earthly lives. They were neither glorified nor tortured, but lived in shades of hunger and thirst. To ease this shadow existence, the living provided offerings: food, water, beer, and oil. Rituals ensured that the bond between family and ancestor endured. Funerary customs reflected this duty of care. Bodies were often wrapped in reed mats or placed in clay coffins, then buried beneath the floors of houses. This proximity of the dead to the living was not accidental. Ancestors were part of the household still, woven into daily life. To pour libations through clay pipes into the grave was an act of devotion and necessity, for without sustenance, the Giddim might become restless. Restless spirits were feared, for they could bring misfortune or illness to the living. The tomb, therefore, was not simply a container of remains but a channel of relationship. Archaeology reveals burial pits with jars of beer, bread loaves, and small personal objects, combs, beads, tools, and figurines. In royal burials, such as the famous Royal Cemetery of the scale was far grander. There, chambers contained gold, silver, elaborate lyres, and chariots. Servants and attendants were buried alongside rulers, suggesting that even in the underworld, status and service were expected to continue. The royal tombs of excavated in the early 20th century, revealed a haunting picture of Mesopotamian belief. In the tomb of Queen Puabi, for example, dozens of attendants were interred with her, adorned in jewelry and fine dress. Some scholars suggest they drank a ritual poison to accompany their queen into death. Others argue that they were slain as part of the rite. However it occurred, the belief was clear. The queen would not journey alone into Kher. Her power, her court, her music, and her attendants crossed the threshold with her. Yet this vision of the afterlife was not one of eternal joy. Unlike Egypt, with its carefully ordered paradise under Osiris, Mesopotamian texts present the underworld as bleak and inevitable. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, when the hero loses his friend Enkidu, the underworld is described as a place where dust is the food and clay the bread. Kings and commoners alike shared this fate. Death was the great equalizer, but it was softened by memory and offerings from the living. The Kispu ritual became essential, a recurring act in which families offered food and drink to their dead. It was not a single farewell, but a continual relationship. To neglect this duty was dangerous, for it risked leaving one's ancestors hungry, stirring them to wander and trouble the living. In this way, funerary rites stretched far beyond the day of burial. They wove a cycle of remembrance, ensuring that the tomb was not a closed door, but a quiet bridge between worlds. The geography of Mesopotamia itself shaped these customs. In a land of floods and shifting soil, elaborate stone tombs like those of Egypt were rare. Clay, reeds, and mud brick formed the material of graves, yet in their simplicity, these tombs carried weight. Beneath homes and temples, the dead lay close, ensuring their presence remained part of the community's rhythm. The city itself became a shared dwelling for both the living and the dead. The silence of Mesopotamian tombs invites reflection. They whisper of a worldview both pragmatic and mystical. Death was certain, the underworld unavoidable, but bonds of kinship softened its edges. When families poured water into the earth, when they placed bread at the graveside, they affirmed that love endured beyond mortality. The underworld may have been dim, but memory could kindle light within it. There is an unresolved tenderness. In these practices, one wonders what comfort families took as they poured libations through the clay channels into unseen chambers. Did they believe their father's spirit truly drank the water? Did they imagine their mother reaching out for the bread? Or did they simply hope, in the silence, that their care was not lost? Mesopotamian funerary rites remind us of the earliest human attempts to answer death's silence. They reveal a people who, while facing the inevitability of dust, sought to weave continuity. Their tombs were not abandoned places, but living spaces of remembrance. In their rituals, they crafted bridges between breath and shadow, between hearth and underworld. Perhaps that is why the whispers of Mesopotamian tombs still linger in the archaeological record. For in each clay jar, each offering, each buried lyre, we hear not only the weight of death, but the persistence of love. And we are left to wonder, when they poured the final libation into the earth, did the Giddim stir in gratitude, or did the silence remain unbroken? Chapter 6. the funerary silence of Neolithic megaliths. Across the wind-swept plains of prehistoric Europe, long before the first word was written in clay or ink, communities gathered to raise stone upon stone. These were the megaliths, immense weathered structures whose weight has outlasted the countless generations that placed them. Some were standing stones arranged like guardians of the horizon. Others were chambers carefully built into the earth, resting places for the dead. To modern eyes, they are silent ruins. But in their age, they were living monuments where burial, ritual, and memory converged. The Neolithic era, stretching from around 10,000 to 4,500 years ago depending on the region, was a time of profound change. Farming replaced foraging. Settled villages grew where nomadic camps once stood. People learned to work the land, to store grain, and to herd animals. With these changes came new relationships with death. The dead were no longer left to the wilderness or hidden in shallow graves. Instead, they were gathered together, interred within monumental tombs, sometimes with pottery, tools, or ornaments, offerings to accompany them on their journey. These tombs were not random piles of stone. Their design was deliberate, thoughtful, and enduring. Passage graves, like those at Newgrange in Ireland or Maeshowe in Orkney, were aligned with the sun. On the shortest day of winter, a shaft of light would pierce the narrow entrance and travel down the dark corridor, illuminating the chamber within. For those who entered, this must have seemed more than chance. It was the return of light to the resting place of the ancestors, a reminder that even in the stillness of death, renewal was promised. The silence of these megaliths was not emptiness. It was full of meaning. When communities walked through the stone passages, they stepped into a world set apart from ordinary life. The tomb was more than a resting place. It was a threshold between the living and the dead, between darkness and light, between time that passes and time that endures. To stand within such a chamber was to feel both the weight of stone and the weight of generations. Archaeological finds suggest that these tombs were not closed permanently after burial. Many were revisited. Bones were rearranged, removed, and replaced. The dead were not sealed away. They remained part of the community, their presence sustained through ritual. Some tombs contained the remains of dozens, even hundreds of individuals. Men, women, and children were gathered together, not in isolation, but in collective memory. To enter was to be surrounded by kin, the living visiting the company of the dead. The stones themselves became silent participants in this cycle. Their alignment with stars and solstices suggests a cosmic dimension. These were not merely graves, but calendars of eternity. The slow turning of the seasons was inscribed in stone. Each shaft of light that fell into the chambers spoke of cycles beyond one lifetime. The dead rested not only in earth, but also in the turning sky. Why did people labor to raise such monuments? The stones are immense, some weighing many tons, dragged over hills and across rivers without the aid of metal tools or wheels. It was a communal act, requiring the strength of many hands and the unity of will. To move stone was to weave the community together. The effort itself was ritual. In raising the tomb, they raised their identity, their memory, and their belief that death was not an ending, but a return. Many scholars interpret these tombs as womb-like structures, the chambers, often round or oval, suggest enclosure, protection, and rebirth. The dead were placed within the earth as if within the body of a mother. Death, then, was not exile, but return, a passage back into origins waiting for renewal. Whether literal or symbolic, this imagery permeates the Neolithic imagination, life moving in cycles, the seasons turning, death leading back into life. The silence of these stones still lingers. Visit them today, and the wind carries through their openings, echoing faintly in the chambers. Light creeps slowly across carved spirals and geometric patterns etched into stone walls. These markings, circles, lines, spirals, may have carried sacred meaning, or may have been a way to inscribe eternity into rock. We cannot know their full intent, but their presence deepens the mystery. They remind us that for the builders, these were not only tombs, but places where meaning itself was carved into permanence. The Neolithic megaliths invite a quiet kind of reflection. They stand unmoved through centuries of rain, snow, and sun, yet their purpose was deeply human: to grieve, to remember, to connect with forces larger than life and longer than death. In their silence, we hear not emptiness, but continuity. We hear the care of communities who gathered, who lifted, who aligned, and who believed that stone could hold memory. Perhaps that is their enduring lesson. That death, when embraced not with fear, but with reverence, can become a bridge rather than a wall. That silence, when shared among stones and shadows, is not absence, but presence. The megaliths remain, whispering across millennia. They do not speak in words, they speak in weight, in alignment, in the enduring patience of stone beneath shifting skies. And as one stands before them, the question arises: did those ancient builders feel the same quiet awe, the same solemn wonder that still flows through their monuments today? Chapter 7: The Mayan Passage to Xibalba. In the heart of the tropical forests of Central America, the Maya built cities of stone and temples that rose like stairways into the sky. Yet for all their brilliance in architecture, astronomy, and mathematics, they also carried a deep concern for the journey beyond life. For the Maya, death was not an abrupt ending, but a passage. It opened a road to Xibalba, the underworld, a realm of challenges, trials, and divine encounters. Unlike some traditions where the afterlife was imagined as either a place of reward or punishment, the Mayan vision was more complex. Xibalba was not hell in the Christian sense, nor was it a paradise like the fields of other mythologies. It was a layered space, a place of darkness and testing. Within its depths resided the lords of death, deities who ruled over sickness, fear, and decay. Yet this was also the place where the soul would prove its strength, find its direction, and continue its existence in relation to the gods. The name itself, Xibalba, translates roughly as place of fright or place of fear. But within Mayan thought, fear was not meaningless, it was transformative. To face the terrors of the underworld was to pass through the most essential trial of being. Archaeology and mythology together provide glimpses of this journey. The Popol Vuh, a sacred narrative preserved in the highlands of Guatemala, tells of the hero twins, Hunahpu and Xbalanque, who descended into Xibalba to confront the lords of death. They faced houses of trials, one of darkness, one of knives, one of bats, one of fire. Each house was designed to defeat them. Yet through cunning, courage, and sacrifice, the twins outwitted their adversaries, eventually overcoming death itself. Their journey became a map, a symbolic guide to what every soul might expect after death. Funerary practices among the Maya reflected this vision. Burials were rarely simple acts of disposal, they were layered with meaning. The dead were often accompanied by offerings, jade beads, cacao beans, food, or obsidian blades. Each object carried symbolic weight. Jade, precious and enduring, was linked to breath and life force. A bead placed in the mouth could symbolize the continuation of spirit. Cacao, so deeply valued in Mayan life that it was once used as currency, represented sustenance, a form of energy for the road ahead. Food offerings suggested hospitality, ensuring that the soul would not travel hungry. The graves themselves varied, according to status and region. Rulers might be placed within elaborate tombs beneath pyramids, their remains encased in ornate jade masks and surrounded by treasures. Commoners, by contrast, were often buried beneath the floors of their homes, connecting the living and the dead within a single domestic space. Death did not sever the relationship between family members. It folded them together, binding the household across both sides of existence. In some cases, the tomb was painted with scenes or marked with hieroglyphs that spoke of journeys and prayers. The body was carefully positioned, sometimes with red, cinnabar pigment sprinkled over the bones, a gesture symbolizing blood, rebirth, and vitality. To bury the dead was not to consign them to silence, but to provide them with tools, direction, and remembrance for their passage through Xibalba. The Maya believed that not all souls traveled the same path. Warriors who died in battle, women who died in childbirth, and victims of sacrifice were often thought to ascend to the sky, accompanying the gods of the sun. But those who died ordinary deaths entered Xibalba. Their trials were not punishments, but inevitable stages in the continuation of existence. To imagine the moment of passage, one might picture the stillness of a Mayan household, a body prepared, offerings gathered, prayers whispered. Cacao beans rattled in a gourd, incense rose in thin spirals of smoke, and words were spoken that joined this world with the next. Each action was deliberate, each gift was a bridge. In the soft flicker of firelight, families affirmed that their loved one was not abandoned. The soul was guided, nourished, remembered. The rituals of death also reflect the Maya's understanding of reciprocity. The living sustained the dead, just as the dead, in their way, sustained the living. Offerings did not vanish into nothingness. They carried meaning, energy, and connection across the threshold. A gift of food was not merely symbolic, it was believed to reach the ancestor. To offer jade was to affirm that breath continued. To pour cacao was to send vitality into unseen hands. Temples and ceremonial centers magnified these practices on a communal scale. Priests performed rituals in honor of the gods of death, and entire societies participated in acts that aligned the cycles of life, agriculture, and the underworld. Corn, the staple of Mayan existence, was itself a sacred image of rebirth. Just as kernels buried in the ground returned as stalks of maize, so too did the soul pass into earth, only to be renewed in another form. What strikes the modern observer is how natural death seemed within the Mayan worldview. It was not an enemy to be defeated at all costs, but a passage to be respected and prepared for. The fear that Xibalba evoked was real, but fear was part of the path. The rituals softened it, shaping the transition with meaning. And perhaps for those who stood at the edge of loss, these rituals also softened grief. To place a bead, to pour cacao, to whisper a prayer, these were ways of saying, you are not forgotten, and your journey matters. Even now, the ruins of Mayan cities hold echoes of this dialogue with death. In Copan, in Palenque, in Tikal, tombs beneath temples still bear traces of offerings. In some, jade masks with delicate features preserve the memory of rulers who were believed to continue guiding their people from beyond. In others, simple pottery vessels hold remnants of food, reminders of households that once loved, remembered, and prepared. The passage to Xibalba was never imagined as an easy walk. It was a test filled with trials and with lords who presided over decay and fear. Yet through ritual, the Maya gave the soul direction. Through offerings, they gave it sustenance. And through memory, they gave it dignity. The silence of these tombs today might seem overwhelming. Yet within that silence, the faintest whisper lingers. The whisper of prayers spoken in languages carried through time. The whisper of offerings placed with tender hands. The whisper of families who believed that connection does not dissolve at the boundary of death. And so one is left to wonder, when a jade bead was pressed between lips, or when cacao beans were scattered beside a body, did the mourners believe that they had truly lit a lamp along the road to Xibalba? Or did they sense in their own hearts that the offering was also a bridge, one that kept the living and the dead woven together, even across the vast silence of the underworld? Chapter 8. Tibetan Sky. Burials returning to the vastness. High among the Himalayan peaks, where the earth rises into a silence touched only by wind, snow, and prayer flags, a unique funerary practice took shape. Tibetan Buddhists developed a way of returning the body to nature that is both striking and deeply spiritual. The ritual known as sky burial, or jator, meaning alms to the birds. In this ritual, death is neither hidden nor sealed away. The body of the deceased is offered openly to the elements, given to vultures who descend from the wide sky. To those unfamiliar with the tradition, it may seem stark, even unsettling. Yet within Tibetan thought, sky burial is an act of profound generosity. It is the final gift. The body itself, returned to sustain other beings in the vast cycle of life. Buddhism in Tibet emphasizes the impermanence of the body. The soul, or consciousness, is not thought to linger within the physical form after death. Once the last breath has departed, the body becomes an empty vessel. What remains is not wasted or discarded, but offered. The vultures who consume it are regarded as sacred participants in this final exchange. In their flight, they carry the body into the heavens, dispersing what was once flesh into the infinite expanse of sky. Practical reasons also shape this custom. In the rocky, frozen landscapes of Tibet, where soil is thin and the ground is hard, burial is difficult. Firewood is scarce at such altitudes, making cremation impractical. But beyond practicality, there is symbolism. To give the body to the birds is to recognize the interdependence of all life. One life ends, yet from that end, others are nourished. The ritual itself is carried out with care. After death, the body is prepared by monks or ritual specialists known as Rogyapas, often translated as body breakers. They perform the rite with solemnity, not as a grim task, but as a sacred duty. Prayers are recited, mantras chanted, and the body is cut into pieces so that vultures may carry it away. The birds, circling high above, descend in great numbers. What might appear violent to the eye is, within Tibetan tradition, seen as release. It is believed that when the birds consume the body completely, leaving nothing behind, the ritual has been fulfilled in the purest way. In Tibetan cosmology, this act is closely linked to the idea of bardo, the intermediate state between death and rebirth. The body, no longer needed, is shed. The consciousness continues its journey, shaped by karma, seeking its next form. Meanwhile, the physical form is transformed into sustenance, ensuring that even in death, one contributes to the web of life. Sky burial also reflects the Buddhist practice of compassion. To give without expectation, to offer without attachment, is considered virtuous. Even in silence, the dead participate in generosity. The birds, who are themselves symbols of transition between earth and sky, become partners in this final act of giving. Travelers and scholars who have witnessed the practice often describe its atmosphere not as morbid, but strangely serene. The setting amplifies this feeling. High cliffs, wind-swept plateaus, valleys wrapped in clouds. The sky burial grounds are chosen in places where the horizon feels limitless. The sound of chanting may mingle with the beating of wings. Incense drifts upward, and in that mingling of sky, bird, prayer, and body, the line between matter and spirit seems to blur. For Tibetans, there is no fear in this exposure. The body was always impermanent. To return it openly to the sky is to acknowledge truth. The vultures, far from being despised, are honored. They are called dakinis, sky beings, who assist in carrying the soul's remains beyond the human world. In their descent, they are agents of liberation. Other Buddhist regions, such as parts of Mongolia and Bhutan, practiced similar rituals, though with variations. Yet it is in Tibet that sky burial became most deeply woven into religious and cultural identity. It sits at the meeting point of necessity and belief, of landscape and spirituality. This ritual also raises questions for the modern mind. What does it mean to give the body away so completely, to let it vanish into the wings of birds? For many, burial or cremation is tied to memory, to monuments, to places where the living can return. But Tibetan sky burial dissolves that permanence. There is no grave to visit, no ashes to hold. What remains is memory itself, and the sense of having participated in a greater cycle. Perhaps that is the point. To let go fully is the hardest task. Tibetan Buddhism teaches that clinging binds the soul to suffering. By releasing even the body, the last and most intimate possession, one practices the essence of detachment. It is said that watching vultures descend on a body can awaken deep reflection in the living. It is a reminder of mortality, of impermanence, and of the way life continues by constant transformation. What once was human form becomes nourishment for wings that soar into the sky. The sight is not meant to horrify, but to humble. Today, sky burials still take place in parts of Tibet, though with fewer opportunities due to modernization, population changes, and outside pressures. Some sites remain active, guarded by tradition, and protected from casual observers. They endure as living reminders of a worldview that sees death not as a final silence, but as a return to the boundless. And so, in the quiet height of the Himalayas, the ritual continues. Bodies are offered, prayers are spoken, birds descend, and the sky opens its arms. The body dissolves into flight, into feather, into air. What was once bound to earth is carried into infinity. It leaves us with a question, gentle yet unshakable. When the body is gone so completely, taken by wings into the sky, what is it that truly remains? Chapter 9. Celtic cairns and ritual stones. Across the misted landscapes of ancient Europe, long before written chronicles recorded their lives, the Celts raised cairns and stones to honor their dead. These were not mere markers, but enduring symbols of connection between the living, the departed, and the unseen ancestors whose presence was believed to linger in the earth and air. A cairn, at its simplest, was a mound of stones carefully piled, often on high ground. Yet, to the Celts, the act of raising these stones carried weight beyond the physical. Each stone placed by hand became a gesture of remembrance, a way of affirming that the one who had departed was not lost, but carried into a wider cycle. Cairns grew into monuments over generations as tribes returned to add stones for each burial, weaving individual lives into a collective memory. In some regions, megalithic tombs from earlier Neolithic peoples were reused by the Celts, their chambers, becoming sites of renewed ritual. The alignment of these structures with the sun or stars revealed a cosmic dimension. A burial was not only an act of honoring the dead, but of situating them within the rhythms of the heavens. To lay a body within stone was to place it beneath a roof that spoke the language of solstice light and seasonal change. Funerary rites often unfolded in sacred groves, places where trees formed living cathedrals. Druids, the priestly class, held these groves as bridges between worlds. The whisper of wind through branches was considered a voice of the divine, and in the silence of ritual, chants and prayers were offered to guide the spirit onward. Fire sometimes played its role. The burning of offerings, the lighting of torches that flickered against stone. Water, too, was sacred, with rivers and wells acting as thresholds where the living could speak to the dead. Burials varied. Some bodies were interred in simple pits, accompanied by grave goods, weapons, ornaments, or food. Others were placed in stone-lined cists or within cairns that rose like small hills. Each item placed with the dead carried symbolic weight. A sword laid at rest was not merely a weapon, but a recognition of honor, an acknowledgement of the battles, of life. A necklace or bead spoke of identity, of personal worth. Food offerings reflected the belief that the journey into the other world required sustenance. The Celts envisioned death not as an end, but as passage. Their myths described an otherworld, sometimes called Andadwian or Tirnanog, where the soul traveled. This realm was not wholly separate from the living world, but intertwined with it, hidden by veils of mist or water. Burial stones and cairns acted as markers of this crossing, signposts at the edges of human understanding. To stand before one was to feel the closeness of that hidden dimension. Cairns were also communal. Unlike private graves, these rising mounds tied a people together. Each new burial added to the structure, making the monument a shared legacy. To pass by a cairn was to remember not just one life, but many, a chorus of ancestors whose memory shaped tribal identity. In this way, the dead were never isolated. They became part of a living continuum. Seasonal festivals reinforced this connection. At Samhain, when the boundary between the living and the dead was thought to thin, cairns and ritual stones gained renewed significance. Fires were lit, offerings left, and stories told. The mist of autumn hills carried the sense of presences, unseen, as if the cairns themselves whispered of the countless souls they sheltered. Archaeological remains confirm the richness of these practices. Excavations reveal burials layered over centuries, cairns growing slowly as generations honored their dead. Some stones bear carvings, spirals, lines, or figures, whose meanings are partly lost, yet whose repetition suggests deep, symbolic importance. These carvings may have represented journeys, cycles, or the paths of souls across thresholds. To reflect upon these rituals is to glimpse a worldview where the line between life and death was never absolute. The Celts moved through a landscape infused with spirit. Stones stood as anchors of memory. Mists drifting across hills were not empty, but alive with meaning. The cairns were bridges, lifting the departed toward sky, while rooting them in earth. The living, tending to these stones, was a way of tending to themselves. By honoring the ancestors, they affirmed continuity. By placing stones on cairns, they affirmed community. And by standing silently in groves or among hills, they reaffirmed the mystery that life could never fully explain. Even now, cairns remain Walkers on remote hills may come across them, still standing against time, their stones piled with patience by hands long gone. To pause before them is to sense something ancient, not only the weight of rock, but the weight of memory. The Celts believed that their dead walked close, that their voices could be felt in wind, in water, in stone. Each cairn was both a grave and a prayer, both a monument and a message. And perhaps, as the mist drifts across the ritual hills, that message still lingers. That to be remembered is to remain unseen but present in the quiet rhythms of the earth. What then do these silent cairns ask of us? To remember the lives once placed within them, or to accept that our own steps too will someday echo into the stones? Chapter 10. Roman funeral processions and the voices of ancestors. In the vast and ordered world of Rome, death was not treated as a private loss alone. It was both a family duty and a civic responsibility, an event that bound together household and state, memory, and community. Funerals became stages where the living honored the dead, but also reaffirmed Rome's deepest values: continuity, ancestry, and the weight of tradition carried forward. The procession, or pompa funebris, was the most visible expression of this. It wound through the streets with solemn rhythm, a movement that blended sorrow with ceremony. At its heart lay the idea that the dead did not disappear, but joined a lineage that stretched backwards through time. By honoring them, the living tied themselves into that lineage, ensuring that Rome itself endured through the constancy of memory. At the front of the procession came musicians, often with flutes or horns, their sounds carrying a plaintive echo. Professional mourners followed, women whose voices rose in ritual lament, not only to express grief, but to make it audible, to ensure that the city itself felt the absence. Behind them came actors wearing wax masks of the family's ancestors, called imagines. These masks had been carefully preserved in household shrines, passed from one generation to the next. When worn in funerals, they allowed the ancestors to walk again, their faces seen by the living. The presence of these masks was more than symbolic. It made clear that every Roman death was not an isolated event, but part of a greater chain. The body of the deceased was carried on a bier, draped and adorned according to rank. Senators, magistrates, and generals were often accompanied by the tokens of their offices, rods of authority, military standards, or trophies of victory. Even in death, the civic identity of the individual was displayed. For ordinary citizens, the procession was smaller, yet the principle remained. To be carried through the city was to be remembered, to take a final journey among one's peers. Sacrifices were offered, sometimes of animals, sometimes of incense and food. These were gifts to the gods and, to the manes, the spirits of the dead. Romans believed that the manes inhabited a shadow world that paralleled the city of the living. To care for them was essential, for neglected spirits could become restless, wandering as shades. The funeral procession, with its sacrifices, was both farewell and appeasement, ensuring that the soul passed peacefully into its new existence. At the end of the march came the oration. In the forum or at the family tomb, words were spoken, not only about the individual but about their place in Rome's collective story. Great men had their deeds recited in detail, their victories remembered, their virtues praised. But even in modest families, the oration connected the dead to the living, a reminder that each life contributed to the strength of the whole. Cicero, in his writings, described these orations as moments where the Roman people learned their history, not through books but through voices. For Romans, funerals served multiple layers of meaning. They honored the deceased, they consoled the living, but they also trained memory, teaching each generation that they stood within a long chain of ancestors. By parading masks of the dead, Rome declared that the city itself was built upon countless lives. And this was not only personal remembrance, it was civic education. The practices extended beyond the day of burial. Romans observed festivals like Parentalia and Lemuria, when families offered food and wine to their ancestors, or performed rites to ward off restless spirits. These yearly cycles reinforced the bond between worlds. The dead were not gone. They remained part of the household and part of the city, their presence acknowledged in both quiet offerings and public ceremony. The imagery of the funeral procession also reveals something about Roman views of time. The masks of ancestors showed the past walking alongside the present. The lamentations gave voice to grief, but also kept the sound of continuity alive. Sacrifices looked toward the divine, bridging the mortal and eternal. Death was thus framed not as an ending, but as a passage within a network of obligations, to family, to gods, to the state. Archaeological finds, inscriptions, tomb reliefs, and surviving accounts confirm these patterns. Reliefs carved on sarcophagi sometimes show the funeral march with its line of mourners, musicians, and ancestors. Inscriptions speak of the virtues of the dead, their roles in the army, in politics, or in family life. Tombs themselves, often built along the roads leading into Rome, were designed so that the dead remained present to those entering and leaving the city. To walk the Via Appia was to pass between voices of the past, carved in stone, watching silently. To reflect on this is to sense the Roman conviction that life was never lived in isolation. Each individual belonged to family, to ancestors, and to the wider body of Rome. The funeral procession was less about finality than about weaving the departed into an enduring fabric. And yet, there is an undertone of mystery. What did it mean? To wear the mask of an ancestor, to feel the weight of their likeness on one's face? Did those who marched in funerals sense the nearness of the dead, as if the streets of marble held echoes of countless processions before them? The Romans believed that their city lived in two forms, one of stone and law, visible to all, and one of shadows and spirits, carried by memory. The funeral procession joined these two realms. The living walked, the dead followed, and in that movement, Rome declared itself whole. Perhaps the silent march that once wound through those streets still lingers in the imagination. The sound of horns fading, the masks glinting, the bier moving slowly forward. A reminder that every city, every family, is shadowed by its ancestors. And in the quiet of those ancient avenues, the question remains: when the living carry the dead, is it not also the dead who continue to carry the living? Chapter 11. Japanese Kofun and Silent Mounds. Across the islands of early Japan, long before written chronicles shaped the story of the nation, the land itself bore witness to the memory of the dead. Rising gently from plains and river valleys were immense burial mounds called kofun. These earthen monuments, some as large as small mountains, became the resting places of rulers, warriors, and elites. More than tombs, they were landscapes of reverence, linking earth and sky, memory and power, the living and the departed. The word kofun simply means ancient grave, but these mounds carried far more than the weight of soil. Constructed between the 3rd and 7th centuries CE, during what historians call the Kofun period, they reveal a society finding its identity through ritual and form. The sheer scale of the mounds, especially those shaped like keys when viewed from above, suggests not only wealth but cosmology, an effort to shape the landscape into a reflection of divine order. At the heart of each mound lay the burial chamber. Stone-lined and carefully sealed, it sheltered the body of the deceased along with objects meant to accompany them into the unseen world. Mirrors, swords, beads, and armor were placed with intention. Mirrors reflected the sun, a symbol of Amaterasu, the Shinto sun goddess whose light was thought to sanctify rulers. Swords and armor represented protection, strength, and the role of the deceased as guardian even in death. Clay figurines known as haniwa were set upon the mound's surface. Human forms, animals, and houses fashioned with deliberate stillness. Their presence was protective, as if a silent army stood watch over the passage between worlds. The construction of kofun required immense communal effort. Thousands of laborers may have been involved in moving soil, laying stone, and shaping the monumental earthworks. The act of building was as important as the final resting place. Through this labor, the living honored the dead and, in turn, affirmed the authority of the rulers who claimed descent from the divine. These mounds became symbols of centralized power, uniting people beneath both earthly leaders and the celestial order those leaders represented. Viewed from the ground, a kofun might appear as a hill, quiet, grass-covered, blending with the natural environment. But from above, their forms are striking. Many take on the distinctive keyhole shape, a circle joined to a square or triangle, a design found nowhere else in the world. Scholars still debate its meaning. Was it a union of heaven and earth, circle and square, spirit and matter? Or did it reflect political symbolism, a shape recognizable to all who approached, a sign that here lay a ruler chosen to link human and divine? The silence of the design leaves the question open, yet the intent is clear. The mound was not just a grave, but a statement of cosmic alignment. Within these burial landscapes, ritual played a quiet but powerful role. Offerings of food and drink, ceremonies of purification, and the recitation of prayers accompanied burials. The haniwa figures themselves were part of this ritual dialogue. Standing in rows, they may have represented attendants, guardians, or even the community itself. Horses and warriors fashioned in clay stood as eternal companions, bridging the gap between the living society and its buried leaders. In this way, death was not separation, but continuation, a dialogue between realms conducted in silence and form. The kofun also embody the relationship between nature and memory. Covered with trees, grass, and shifting light, they became part of the landscape, both natural and human-made. Some were surrounded by moats, reflecting sky and stars on their surface. The mound, the water, the horizon. Together they formed a space where earth, heaven, and reflection met. Standing near one even today, the air seems heavier, more deliberate, as though the mound itself is breathing with time. Archaeological excavations have revealed treasures inside these tombs. The bronze mirrors, intricately decorated, suggest ties to the continent, to China and Korea, where similar objects were symbols of both political alliance and sacred authority. Armor and weapons hint at a warrior culture, where strength and protection were virtues carried into death. The careful arrangement of objects shows that burial was not only about provision, but about meaning, a way of shaping identity beyond life. Yet despite their grandeur, kofun remain shrouded in mystery. Some of the largest, like the colossal Daisen kofun in Osaka, said to be the tomb of Emperor Nintoku, remain closed to excavation. Protected by the Imperial Household Agency, they are treated not as archaeological sites, but as sacred ground, part of the unbroken lineage of the Japanese imperial family. The silence of these mounds is therefore both physical and political. What lies within is left undisturbed, a presence acknowledged but not revealed. This silence deepens their power. To look upon a kofun is to see a monument that does not speak, yet holds within its stories of a society's birth, its rulers, and its cosmology. They are not ruins, but living presences in the landscape, still shaping identity centuries later. And perhaps that is their truest function. By remaining silent, the kofun invite reflection. What is buried within the earth does not vanish, but becomes part of the land's breath, its rhythm of seasons, its quiet endurance. Each mound is both tomb and horizon, a place where memory is held not in words, but in earth itself. When one stands before a kofun today, the question arises softly. Do these mounds hold the voices of the dead, or do they echo the silence of the earth? The same silence from which life itself emerges and to which it inevitably returns. Chapter 12. African Funeral Drums and Sacred Rhythm. Across the vast landscapes of Africa, from savannas and forests to deserts and coastlines, the drum has long been more than an instrument. It is a voice, a messenger, a bridge between the living and the unseen. In life, drums mark birth, initiation, marriage, and war. In death, they accompany the soul's passage, guiding it toward the realm of ancestors. The sound of the drum is never merely sound. It is rhythm turned into meaning, vibration turned into prayer. In many African traditions, death was not seen as an end, but as a transition. The one who departed moved from the visible world into the company of those who had gone before. Ancestors remained present, watching, guiding, sometimes protecting, sometimes warning. Funerals, therefore, were not only for mourning, they were for recognition, an acknowledgement that one among the living had joined the long lineage of the unseen. Drums, in their steady resonance, made this truth audible. They spoke what words could not. The patterns varied from region to region, yet the principle remained. A drumbeat could announce a death across villages, carrying the news farther than a voice could travel. In West Africa, talking drums conveyed tones of language, allowing mourners miles away to understand who had passed and when the funeral would be held. These instruments, shaped like hourglasses and pressed under the arm to vary pitch, did more than beat time. They carried speech across the air so that the rhythm itself became a language. At the funeral, the drumbeat shifted, no longer announcement. Alone, it became invocation. The steady pulse represented the heartbeat of the community, binding the living together in grief and solidarity. At times, the rhythm grew complex, imitating the footsteps of the soul as it began its journey. At other times, it slowed into long, spacious beats. A reminder that silence, too, is part of rhythm, that the journey of the dead is not hurried, but measured. In many traditions, the drummers were not merely musicians. They were ritual specialists, keepers of sacred knowledge. Their hands carried responsibility, for each rhythm had a role. Some rhythms called the community to gather, others summoned spirits or signaled offerings. Still others were played to settle disputes, to calm grief, or to mark the moment when the body was lowered into the earth. To strike the drum wrongly at such times was not a mistake in music, but a disruption in the order of the passage. Consider the Akan of Ghana. For them, funerals were occasions of profound significance, sometimes lasting days. Drumming and dancing expressed both sorrow and honor, acknowledging the loss while celebrating the life lived. To outsiders, the energy of the dance might seem at odds with mourning, but within the culture it was fitting. Death was not disappearance. It was movement into another state, one that still held ties to the living. The rhythm was not denial. of grief, but its transformation and a way of turning absence into continuity. Elsewhere, among the Yoruba, drumming carried an even deeper cosmological role. The Bata drums spoke directly to the Orishas, the deities, and intermediaries between humans and the divine. At funerals, these rhythms linked the deceased with both ancestors and gods, making the passage part of the eternal dialogue between heaven and earth. The beat was not only heard by human ears, but believed to be heard in the spirit world. Each strike of the skin sent vibration outward, upward, and inward, beyond human reach. Silence, too, played its part. Between drum beats lay spaces, pauses filled with expectation and memory. In African thought, silence was not emptiness, but rhythm's companion. Just as a heartbeat is measured not only by contraction but by release, the absence of sound was part of the message. When drumming ceased at the end of a funeral, the quiet carried meaning. It was not the void, but the echo of rhythm lingering in the body and in the earth itself. The physicality of the drum mattered as well. Crafted from wood and animal skin, it embodied the union of nature's gifts. The tree gave its trunk, hollowed and shaped by human hands. The animal gave its hide, stretched and tightened to form the drumhead. In death rituals, this union of tree and animal symbolized the cooperation of life forms, echoing the belief that all beings, human, animal, plant and spirit, share the same cycle of return. To strike the drum was to awaken that unity, reminding all who listened that the dead too remain part of the living whole. Funeral drumming also shaped memory. In some communities, the patterns played for a person became linked with their identity. The community would recall not only the face or deeds of the deceased, but the rhythms struck in their honor. Music became memory, echoing across generations. A grandparent's funeral might be remembered not through written record, but through the lingering impression of the rhythms that filled the air on that day. And yet, for all their clarity, funeral drums always carried mystery. Did the ancestors truly hear them? Did the vibrations travel into the unseen? Was the rhythm simply a communal act of healing, or was it also a language the soul itself followed? The traditions hold both views, practical and mystical, communal and cosmic. The drum is at once an instrument and an oracle, a sound in air and a guide through silence. Today, in many parts of Africa, the tradition continues. Even with modern instruments, with microphones and recorded music, the drum remains central. At funerals, families still call upon drummers, not out of habit alone, but out of conviction that rhythm belongs to passage, just as breath belongs to life. To remove the drum would be to leave the journey incomplete. And so, across time, the funeral drum speaks. Its voice rises and falls, sometimes commanding, sometimes whispering. It frames grief, but also lifts it. It links generations, reminding the living that they too will one day be carried by rhythm into the company of ancestors. And when the last beat falls and hands rest in silence, the air still remembers. The earth still vibrates. The body may be gone, the drum quiet, but the rhythm lingers, like a pulse beneath the soil, like a memory that never entirely fades. Perhaps this is the meaning hidden between the beats, that death, like rhythm, is not an end, but a pause, a silence not of absence, but of continuation, waiting for the next sound to rise. Would you hear it if you listened closely? The echo of the ancestors drumming softly still. Chapter 13, Chinese Ancestral Rites and the Spirit Tablets. In the long arc of Chinese history, Few traditions carried as much weight as the honoring of ancestors. Within this framework, funerals were not isolated events, but part of a continuous cycle, a rhythm that joined the living and the dead in one household of memory. To bury a person was not to send them away, but to give them a new place within the family's spiritual order. At the center of this order stood the spirit tablet, a simple wooden or stone plaque, yet believed to house the enduring presence of the departed. Chinese ancestral rites reveal how death was not viewed as a rupture, but as transformation. A person who left the living world did not vanish into silence. Instead, their identity shifted, their role changed. They became an ancestor, a guardian, a figure of remembrance and quiet influence. In this way, the structure of the family extended beyond time. The living owed care to the dead, and the dead, in turn, were thought to protect the living. The spirit tablet embodied this relationship. Usually inscribed with the name of the deceased, sometimes with titles or dates, it was placed on the family altar. There it stood among incense, offerings of food, and ritual vessels. To outsiders, the scene might appear symbolic, but to those within the tradition, it was more than memory. The tablet was not simply a marker. It was a dwelling place for the spirit. To bow before it was to bow before the ancestor themselves, present though unseen. This practice drew from deep philosophical roots. In Confucian teaching, filial piety, the respect and care for parents and elders, formed the foundation of moral life. To honor the dead was not optional, it was an extension of virtue, a continuation of duty. In this sense, funerals and ancestral rites were both ethical and spiritual. They maintained harmony between generations, ensuring that the living upheld gratitude, while the dead remained woven into the moral fabric of the family. Ritual was precise. When a family member died, a tablet would be prepared, placed first, near the coffin, and later installed in the ancestral shrine. Incense was burned, carrying fragrant smoke upward, a symbol of communication between earth and heaven. Food was offered, rice, tea, fruits, wine, not for consumption by the living, but as nourishment for the spirit. Each act was performed with care, for to neglect the proper ritual was to risk imbalance. Ancestral spirits, if forgotten, could become restless. If honored, they could bring blessing, fortune, and protection. These rites were not confined to the household. Across dynasties, emperors performed grand ceremonies for their forebears. The imperial ancestral temple in Beijing, built during the Ming dynasty, stood as a place where rulers offered sacrifices to their line. By doing so, they affirmed both legitimacy and continuity, tying political power to sacred ancestry. What occurred on the imperial scale echoed what took place in countless villages and homes, each family shrine a smaller reflection of a greater order. The spirit tablets themselves carried a quiet symbolism. Wood, carved and inscribed, became a vessel for continuity. In many traditions, the names of multiple generations were recorded, creating a lineage of presence. Each tablet was a voice across time, reminding descendants of their roots. Families might trace their history through these plaques, each one a thread in the tapestry of memory. To look at them was to see not absence, but a chain of existence stretching backward without visible end. Taoist and Buddhist influences also shaped ancestral rites. Taoist ritual specialists sometimes conducted ceremonies to guide the soul through cosmic realms, while Buddhist monks chanted sutras for merit, helping the deceased find peace in the afterlife. In both cases, the spirit tablet remained the focal point in the household, anchoring the departed in relation to the family, even as larger cosmologies unfolded beyond. The atmosphere of a funeral was thus layered. There was grief expressed through weeping and lamentation. There was also reverence, shown through bows, offerings and prayers. And beyond grief and reverence lay something steadier, the understanding that life and death were not opposites, but parts of the same cycle. When incense smoke curled upward, it seemed to carry this very truth, rising, fading, yet never lost, just as the ancestors' presence lingered even after the body had gone. Over time, the rites became woven into seasonal rhythms. The Qingming festival, known as Tomb Sweeping Day, was one of the most important occasions. Families traveled to ancestral graves, cleaned the tombs and renewed offerings. Spirit tablets within the home connected to graves outside it, so that remembrance took place in both sacred interior and open landscape. In this way, ancestors were honored not once but continually, their presence renewed with each cycle of seasons. What did it mean for silence to hold so much? At the altar, the air was still, save for the faint crackle of incense. Yet within that silence, voices were felt. The remembered advice of elders, the presence of parents, grandparents, distant ancestors whose names were carried forward. To kneel in such a space was to feel history pressed close, not as an abstract record but as living connection. For centuries, these rites bound families together, offering stability in a world often shaken by war, famine, or change. No matter what storms passed, the spirit tablets remained, quiet yet steadfast, linking present lives with an unbroken chain of memory. They reminded each generation that identity was more than individual. It was relational, rooted in those who came before, and perhaps this is where the mystery deepens. Were the ancestors truly present in those wooden tablets? Or was the power of the ritual found in the act of remembrance itself? The rites suggest both. The family believed that their forebears watched, listened, and responded. At the same time, the rhythm of offerings and incense ensured that the living never forgot. Spirit and memory intertwined, inseparable. In the end, the silence of the altar carried more than absence. It carried continuity. It carried gratitude. It carried the unseen voices of centuries, still echoing in the rhythm of incense smoke, in the inscriptions carved into wood, in the bowing of generations before the tablets of their ancestors. And one may wonder, in that silence, when incense has burned low and the offerings are cleared away, does the ancestor hear, or is it the living who are changed by the act of remembrance? Perhaps both. Perhaps the altar is not only a space where the dead are honored, but where the living learn to carry their presence quietly across time. Chapter 14, Inuit Death, Rituals Beneath the Polar Sky. In the far reaches of the Arctic, where night stretches for months and the cold sculpts every choice, the Inuit shaped their rituals of death in ways that were both practical and spiritual. Survival dictated much of their life, and yet within the urgency of cold winds and shifting ice, they wove meaning, reverence, and deep belief. A funeral was not only an act of farewell, it was an alignment of the living with the vast polar world and of the soul with a sky filled by the dancing lights of the aurora. The Inuit faced a constant reality. Resources were limited, and every action carried weight. The land of snow and ice offered no space for monuments of stone or temples of marble. What remained instead were rituals carried in memory, passed by word and practice, embedded in the rhythms of survival. Death was understood not as a final break, but as part of a circle in which the soul traveled on. The aurora glowing across the night sky was often imagined as a pathway for the departed, shimmering above the frozen seas. To look up at those lights was to glimpse a movement of spirits, a sign that the journey continued. Funerary customs varied across Inuit groups, shaped by region and time, yet certain themes remained constant. When a person died, their body was treated with care, but also with a sense of necessity. The harsh ground, frozen for much of the year, often made deep burial impossible. Instead, the body might be wrapped in skins and laid upon the earth or within a simple cairn of stones. These coverings protected the remains from animals and the elements, but they also created a space of respect. Even in a land of scarcity, the departed were not abandoned. Objects were sometimes placed with the body. Tools, weapons, or items from daily life might accompany the deceased, reminders of their role within the community. These offerings served both practical and spiritual purposes. In the belief system of the Inuit, the soul, or sometimes souls for the human being, was often thought to hold more than one, continued into another realm. To send the dead with what they might need was an act of care, a recognition that existence did not end but shifted into a new form. One important aspect of Inuit belief was the idea of balance with spirits, both human and animal. Death carried with it a responsibility. The living had to ensure that the passage of the soul was smooth and that the relationship between the worlds remained unbroken. Neglect or improper ritual could lead to unrest, with consequences for the entire community. In this way, funerary practices were never only about one individual. They carried the weight of harmony for the group. The aurora borealis, painting the Arctic sky in green and red, played a powerful role in imagination. Some Inuit traditions describe the lights as the souls of the dead, playing a celestial game of ball with a walrus skull. Others saw them as torches carried by spirits guiding the way for those newly departed. The lights were not simply natural spectacle. They were woven into the texture of meaning, the sky itself becoming a bridge between what was seen and what was unseen. Shamans, or angakkuk, sometimes guided rituals. They were the mediators between the human world and the spirit world, interpreting signs, offering chants, and ensuring the soul's safe passage. The shaman's role was not always tied directly to funerals, but their presence in the broader spiritual life of the Inuit made them vital in moments of transition. Death, like illness or misfortune, was never isolated. It rippled through the spiritual web, and the shaman's knowledge could help restore balance. Silence was another element of these rituals. In the vast Arctic, sound carried differently. A single drumbeat, the crunch of snow, the whisper of wind could feel magnified. When a death occurred, the silence that followed was not emptiness but a kind of attentive stillness. The snow itself seemed to listen. In that quiet, the living performed their duties, wrapping, carrying, and placing the body with a care that matched both reverence and survival. Silence framed the moment, turning necessity into ritual. For the Inuit, animals were also bound to these beliefs. The seal, the whale, the caribou, creatures that sustained life, were treated with spiritual respect, for their spirits too traveled after death. The human soul and the animal soul shared a similar journey. In funerary practices, this awareness lingered. The line between human and environment was thin, and in honoring the dead, the Inuit also reaffirmed their relationship with the living world around them. Family ties were central. A child might be given the name of a recently departed elder, believed to carry some essence of that ancestor. In this way, memory lived not only in ritual but in identity itself. The community carried the departed forward by allowing their presence to resurface in new generations. The spirit tablet of China or the carved mask of Rome was absent here. Instead, the name became the vessel of continuity, spoken daily, embedded in the fabric of survival. The landscape shaped every decision. Where snow drifted high, bodies might be interred in shallow graves. Where ice made digging impossible, stones were gathered instead. In coastal regions, platforms were sometimes built. Whatever the form, the aim was the same: to grant dignity, to allow passage, to mark the living community's care for its dead. Looking at these practices, one sees a merging of necessity and reverence. The harshness of the Arctic did not diminish the spiritual imagination of the Inuit. If anything, it heightened it. The land allowed no excess, so every gesture mattered. Every wrapping of skin, every stone placed, every whispered word beneath the aurora carried weight. The rituals were lean, but within their simplicity lay profound meaning. And so the silence of the snow became part of the rite itself. When the community withdrew, leaving the mound or the cairn behind, the land closed in. Snow drifted, winds shifted, and soon the grave merged with the landscape. Yet for the Inuit, this disappearance was not loss. It was return. The person had rejoined the greater expanse of sky and ice, their soul moving with the aurora, their presence folded back into the wide rhythm of the Arctic. In the end, Inuit funerary traditions remind us that ritual need not be elaborate to be profound. Beneath the polar sky, where survival and spirit are inseparable, the simplest acts of care carried the deepest meaning. The living placed their trust in silence, in snow, in lights that danced above. And perhaps the deepest question lingers still. When the aurora shifts across the frozen night, are we watching the play of light in the atmosphere, or the shimmering passage of countless souls moving endlessly between this world and the next? Chapter 15. Persian Zoroastrian Towers of Silence. High upon barren hills, where the desert winds carried dust and the horizon shimmered in heat, Zoroastrians built the Dakma, or Towers of Silence. These circular stone structures stood apart from villages and cities, set at a distance from daily life. They were not places of fear or shadow, but of necessity and faith, designed to meet one of the most important spiritual obligations within Zoroastrian belief: the safeguarding of purity. In the Zoroastrian worldview, purity was central. Earth, fire, water, and air were all considered sacred creations, infused with the presence of divinity. To pollute them was to disrupt cosmic balance. The body of the living was a vessel of order, but at the moment of death, it was believed to become vulnerable to Druji, the force of decay and evil. Contact with a corpse risked defilement. For this reason, neither burial in the soil nor cremation in fire could be permitted. Both would taint what was meant to remain unspoiled. A different path had to be found. The Towers of Silence offered that solution. Raised as circular enclosures, often with high walls, they provided a controlled space where bodies could be placed upon stone platforms exposed to the open sky. There, under the heat of the sun and the attentive wings of vultures, the flesh of the dead would return quickly to nature. This process, far from being viewed as desecration, was understood as purification. The corruptible elements of the body were dispersed without contaminating earth or flame, leaving only bones, which were later gathered and placed into central wells within the tower. These structures were carefully designed. Within the circle, 3 concentric rings were often laid out, one for men, one for women, and one for children. In this way, even within death, an order was maintained, reflecting the structured vision of the cosmos. At the center stood the ossuary pit, where bones were deposited after exposure. Over time, rain and lime would cleanse them further, reducing what remained to neutral elements, no longer carrying the danger of impurity. The circle was not merely architectural, it echoed the Zoroastrian sense of wholeness, a cycle without beginning or end, where death was not a termination, but part of a broader movement. For the soul, the journey was altogether different. Zoroastrian texts, such as the Vendidad and other later writings, describe the passage of the soul after death. For 3 days it lingered near the body, hovering close, caught between realms. On the dawn of the 4th day, it was believed to encounter the Chinvat Bridge, the Bridge of Judgment. There, the deeds of one's life were weighed. To the righteous, the bridge widened, leading them safely into the house of song, a realm of eternal light. To those whose lives had been marked by falsehood and harm, the bridge narrowed, casting them into the house of lies, a place of torment. This vision gave funerary customs a deep urgency. How one prepared the body, how one treated the dead, all contributed to the order of creation and the balance of the soul. The towers of silence were not only practical solutions, they were expressions of fidelity to Ahura Mazda, the wise lord, who had called humanity to uphold Asha, the principle of truth, order, and righteousness. To place a body in the tower was to act in alignment with divine law, ensuring that creation itself was not harmed by death. Priests, known as mobeds, oversaw these rituals. Their role was to guide the community in purity laws, to recite prayers, and to maintain the sacred separation between what was holy and what was vulnerable to corruption. Funerary ceremonies involved chants from the Avesta, the Zoroastrian scriptures, with invocations to Yazatas, divine beings who guarded the soul's passage. Fires were lit nearby, not to consume the body, but to represent eternal light, the presence of Ahura Mazda. Families gathered in silence, knowing that the body could not be touched directly. Pallbearers used metal tools to carry the deceased, avoiding physical contact, for even that would spread defilement. From a modern perspective, the sight of a body exposed in such a way may seem stark. Yet within its cultural and religious frame, it was an act of dignity and cosmic care. To look upon the tower was not to see abandonment, but to see the fulfillment of a sacred trust. The body was given back to creation without harm, and the soul was released to begin its true journey. The setting of these towers added to their power. Often constructed on hilltops or desolate ridges, they stood silhouetted against the wide Persian sky. From below, they looked like silent sentinels watching over the land. The wind whistled through their stone walls, carrying with it both stillness and memory. Villages nearby knew of their presence, yet daily life continued in the valleys, the sacred and the ordinary kept apart by distance, as the faith required. Reflection arises here. What does it mean to treat earth and fire as so pure that even in death they must remain untouched? For Zoroastrians, this was not symbolic, but deeply practical. Every element was alive with sanctity. To bury a body in soil would be to wound the very ground that gave crops. To burn it would be to stain the fire that cooked food and carried prayer. In honoring creation, strictly they reaffirmed a worldview where human beings were guardians, not owners, of the elements. Over centuries, these towers became distinctive markers of Zoroastrian identity. From ancient Persia to later communities, in India, especially among the Parsis, the practice continued. In Mumbai, for example, dakhmas were built atop hilltops, surrounded by gardens. There too the same silence held, the same rituals unfolded. Yet modern changes have brought challenges. With the decline of vulture populations due to environmental shifts and contamination, the process has slowed. This has forced communities to seek adaptations, yet the devotion to the principle of purity remains strong. In this way, the Towers of Silence stand not only as physical structures but as philosophical monuments. They represent a people's effort to align human life with cosmic law, even at its most fragile moment, death. The act of exposure, the slow return to nature, the prayers whispered under the sun, all join in a rhythm that seeks to protect creation from harm. And so they stand still on hills where wind and sun continue their endless work. They are bridges of stone, linking earth to sky, silence to rhythm, mortality to eternity. To look upon one is to be reminded that every culture finds its own way to carry the dead, and every faith finds its own way to imagine the soul's ascent. Perhaps the question that lingers is this: when the body is gone, carried by birds and scattered by winds, and only silence remains within the circle of stone, where does the soul truly dwell? In the far reaches of light, or still hovering in the quiet, unseen spaces of creation itself? Chapter 16. Aztec Offerings to the Gods of Death. Among the Aztec people, death was not the end of a journey but a passage into one of many possible realms. The living prepared for this passage with offerings and ritual, shaping a sacred dialogue between the world of mortals and the unseen powers of the afterlife. Funerals were never simple farewells. They were structured moments of transition where the soul was guided, protected, and nourished as it set forth into eternity. The Aztec worldview was deeply cyclical. Life and death were intertwined, each feeding the other in endless renewal. The sun itself was thought to rise and fall by the strength of sacrifice, its motion dependent on the energy returned to the cosmos. Human life, too, was part of this rhythm. When someone died, their body was not only mourned but prepared as an offering, an acknowledgement that the individual was now rejoining the sacred cycles that governed the universe. Cremation was the most common practice, though burials also took place in specific contexts. When a body was cremated, ashes were carefully collected and placed into vessels, often accompanied by personal possessions or symbolic objects. These offerings carried meaning beyond material value. A piece of turquoise, for example, was not merely decorative. Its shimmering surface was believed to hold spiritual power, a fragment of the sky made solid. Food placed beside the body, whether maize or tamales, was not just nourishment but sustenance for the journey into the unknown. One of the most poignant offerings was the dog. Archaeological finds and records from early Spanish chroniclers describe how small dogs, often the yellow-coated variety known as Xoloitzcuintli, were buried or symbolically included with the dead. The belief was clear: the dog would serve as a guide across the dangerous waters that separated the living from the land of the dead. Without its help, the soul might wander lost. In this way, even the companionship of animals was carried beyond the grave, binding the everyday world to the sacred. The Aztec afterlife was complex, divided into realms depending not only on one's moral life, but on the manner of death. Warriors who died in battle or women who died in childbirth were believed to accompany the sun, sharing in its radiant strength. Those who drowned, or whose lives were claimed by water, were thought to journey to Tlalocan, a lush paradise ruled by the rain god Tlaloc. For most others, however, the destination was Mictlan, the great underworld governed by Mictlantecutli and Mictecacihuatl, the Lord and Lady of Death. The journey to Mictlan was long and arduous, said to take 4 years. The soul crossed mountains, endured icy winds, and passed through regions of obsidian blades and monstrous creatures. The offerings buried with the dead were not luxuries, but necessities, a form of spiritual provisioning. Turquoise beads, bundles of food, and tools all had their place in this sacred economy, easing the soul's challenges as it moved deeper into the land of shadows. Ritual silence often accompanied these ceremonies. The Aztecs knew the power of words, songs, and chants, yet they also understood the sanctity of stillness. In silence, the transition of the dead was honored. The absence of speech marked a pause in the rhythm of creation itself, a moment when the living world seemed to hold its breath as the soul departed. This silence was not emptiness. It was reverence, a recognition that the boundaries between realms were delicate and that noise might disrupt the fragile crossing. The gods of death were not imagined as cruel arbiters, but as keepers of balance. Mictlantecuhtli, often depicted with a skull face and skeletal body, symbolized the inevitable dissolution of flesh. Yet, he was not an enemy of life. He was its counterpart, ensuring that the cycle remained unbroken. His consort, Mictecacihuatl, the Lady of the Dead, presided over festivals and rituals honoring ancestors. Through them, the Aztecs saw that death was not a negation of existence, but part of the eternal weaving of life's fabric. The offerings made to these gods were therefore acts of balance. A turquoise bead placed in the mouth of the dead was a whisper to eternity, a promise that the cycle would continue. A dog at the side of its master was a bridge across cosmic waters. A meal laid within the grave was not indulgence, but sustenance for a weary traveler. Each object spoke softly to the divine, saying, "This life mattered, and its passage is cared for." Anthropologists note that these rituals served both spiritual and social purposes. They reaffirmed community bonds, reminding the living that every person's fate was woven into the fate of the cosmos. Death was not hidden away, it was acknowledged, structured, and integrated into daily life. Even great rulers, when they passed, were accompanied by elaborate funerary rites, with offerings meant to reflect not only their earthly power, but their new role within the divine order. The Spanish conquest disrupted much of this system, replacing it with Christian burial practices and condemning native rituals as idolatry. Yet fragments of the old beliefs endured. In later centuries, traditions blended, giving rise to practices such as Dia de los Muertos, where offerings of food, flowers, and candles once again honor the dead. The Aztec vision of offerings as whispers to eternity lives on in these acts, even if transformed by time. What lingers is the sense of cosmic reciprocity. The dead required care not only for their own journey, but for the balance of all creation. To neglect offerings was to risk imbalance, a disturbance in the eternal cycles that sustain sun, rain, and life itself. To honor the dead with turquoise, with food, with silence, was to honor the very rhythm of existence, and so we may wonder if each object placed with the dead was a message to the divine. What message do our own parting gestures carry when a life ends and the body is given back to earth, fire, or sky? What offerings do we leave behind? And do they still speak like soft whispers to the eternal balance that binds us all? Chapter 17. Polynesian Ocean Burials. Across the vast expanse of the Pacific, where islands rise like stepping stones in a boundless sea, death was understood not as a closed door, but as a voyage. The ocean itself, which carried canoes across horizons and bound distant lands together, was also imagined as the pathway of the soul. In Polynesian cultures, funerary practices often returned the body to the waters, or else placed remains in caves that opened toward the sea. Every ritual was shaped by the tides, by chants carried on salt air, and by the endless rhythm of waves. In many island communities, burials reflected the intimate relationship between people and the ocean. Some traditions called for the body to be consigned directly to the waters where the currents would take it into the embrace of the deep. In other places, bones were carefully prepared and laid in sea-facing caves, sheltered yet always in sight of the waves. The logic was both practical and sacred. Space on small islands was precious, and the sea offered not only room but a natural connection to the divine. More than that, the ocean was believed to be alive, a vast medium through which souls could travel onward. The Polynesian worldview placed great importance on mana, the spiritual energy present in all things. The sea was rich with mana, unpredictable yet sustaining, a force that both gave and claimed life. Returning the dead to the ocean was not an abandonment, but a gesture of respect, an acknowledgement that the soul must pass back through the elemental forces from which it had drawn strength. Just as fish sustained the living, and storms tested the courage of voyagers, so too did the waters carry the departed to the realms beyond. Chants accompanied these burials. In a culture where knowledge was preserved through oral tradition, words, spoken or sung, carried deep power. Ritual prayers guided the spirit, offering protection against wandering or delay. Some chants invoked the ancestors, asking them to receive the soul and steer it across the invisible currents between worlds. Others describe the ocean itself as a road, a shining path of foam leading to realms of gods and spirits. The sound of human voices mingling with the surf created a layered hymn, one of earth, breath, and water moving together. For the Polynesians, the soul's journey was not imagined in isolation. The ancestors were always near, present in winds, stones, and waves. By placing the body in the sea or in caves washed by the tide, the living acknowledged that the departed was not lost. They had simply joined the greater company of spirits, who lingered at the edge of perception and who continued to influence the health of families and communities. The boundary between the living and the dead was porous, softened by ritual care. And by the ocean's embrace, archaeological evidence across Polynesia shows a variety of practices. In Tonga and Samoa, burial mounds were sometimes raised inland, while in Hawaii, caves along cliffs and shorelines were used to conceal remains. In some parts of the Marquesas and Tahiti, bodies were set adrift on canoes, a final voyage echoing the many journeys of life. Each practice reflected the same underlying truth. The ocean was not a void, but a connective tissue between islands, between families, and between worlds. The ocean burials also carried symbolic meaning in relation to voyaging. Polynesian navigators, among the most skilled in the world, read the stars, swells, and winds to reach lands thousands of miles apart. Death was imagined in similar terms. Just as a voyager might leave familiar shores for unknown islands, so the dead departed for unseen lands across cosmic waters. The offerings and chants prepared them, just as supplies and guidance prepared a canoe. In this way, the metaphor of the journey was not abstract. It was lived, daily, and then extended into the mystery of death. Silence was also part of these rites. After the chants faded, the ocean itself became the mourner, its waves crashing, retreating, and returning without end. This silence was not empty, but resonant, as if the sea itself was offering the last hymn. For those left behind, listening to the waves was a way of hearing the departed one more time. The pulse of the surf, steady and eternal, mirrored the rhythm of existence itself. Departure, return, and renewal. Polynesian death rituals, like many others, were also acts of community. To prepare a body for burial was to reaffirm bonds of kinship, to show that the living honored their obligations even after life had ended. Families gathered to chant, to weep, and to share in the labor of preparing the burial site or canoe. These moments were both solemn and connective, weaving grief into a wider web of belonging. The dead did not vanish into solitude. They were carried forward by the voices and hands of their people. European contact in the 18th and 19th centuries brought changes to these practices. Christian missionaries often discouraged or outlawed traditional ocean burials, replacing them with churchyard graves and imported rituals. Yet the memory of the older ways persisted. In chants, in oral histories, and in the quiet knowledge of elders, the sea continued to be seen as a sacred passage. Even today, in parts of Polynesia, scattering ashes into the ocean remains a deeply symbolic act, echoing the ancient connection between death, water, and journey. What lingers most is the imagery of the ocean as both path and hymn. A body lowered into the sea does not vanish, but becomes part of a living rhythm that continues beyond sight. A cave filled with bones facing the horizon is not a sealed tomb, but a doorway open to the winds and waves. In each act, the living acknowledge that the soul has taken to the waters, traveling onward into mystery. And so the question arises, when the waves fall silent in the night and the stars spread across the vast sky, is the ocean still carrying the voices of those who have gone before? If we listen long enough to the rhythm of the surf, might we hear, hidden within its pulse, the final hymn of lives returned to the sea? Chapter 18. Native American Funeral Ceremonies of the Plains. Across the wide grasslands of North America, where the horizon stretches in every direction and the wind moves like a living spirit, the peoples of the plains shaped their funerary customs with reverence, song, and fire. To them, death was not an abrupt ending. It was a passage, a continuation of life into another realm that mirrored the expanses they knew so well. The great sky above, the flowing wind, the steady beat of drums. All were reminders that the soul journeyed onward, guided by both earthly, ritual, and unseen ancestors. The Plains tribes, Lakota, Cheyenne, Comanche, Kiowa, and many others, carried traditions that varied in detail, yet shared a common thread. They understood death as entry into the spirit world, a dimension that touched but did not break from earthly existence. Ceremonies were therefore not just acts of farewell, but acts of connection. By honoring the dead, the living kept open the channels between the world of flesh and the world of spirit. One of the most prominent elements in these ceremonies was the sacred fire. Flames were kindled to carry prayers upward, their smoke seen as a visible thread linking earth to sky. Families would tend the fire with offerings, tobacco, sweetgrass, or food, each placed carefully with words spoken aloud. The fire was more than warmth or light. It was a messenger, a transforming force that bridged the living with those who had gone before. Watching the smoke curl and dissolve into the air, people were reminded that the soul too rose and traveled beyond sight. Prayer ties were another essential part of Plains funerals. Small bundles of cloth filled with tobacco or sage were tied and offered as gifts to the spirits. Each tie was a prayer made visible, carrying intention and care. Strung together, they created a chain of connection, sometimes draped across trees, poles, or graves. The colors of the ties held meaning, often symbolizing directions, elements, or stages of life. By preparing and placing them, mourners expressed their love in tangible form, a reminder that grief itself could be woven into the sacred fabric of ceremony. Drums and songs filled the air during these rites. The drumbeat was often described as the heartbeat of the earth, steady and grounding. In funerals, its rhythm called out to the spirit, guiding it along its journey. Songs, many of which had been passed down through generations, told of passage, of ancestors waiting, of horizons opening. Sung in the language of the people, they carried both beauty and power. A soul did not travel in silence. It traveled with the voices of its people, lifted by melody, protected by rhythm. For some tribes, the act of placing the body was itself a sacred decision. Among the Lakota and other plains groups, scaffolds or tree burials were sometimes used, lifting the body above the earth to rest closer to the sky. Wrapped in hides or blankets, the deceased was raised into the open air, where wind, sun, and birds shared in the process of returning them to nature. This gesture reflected the belief that life did not belong solely to humans, but was part of a wider circle shared with all beings. Later, remains might be gathered and placed in sacred places, completing the cycle. In other contexts, burials were made in the earth, sometimes marked with stones, staffs, or offerings. Grave goods, pipes, weapons, food, or personal belonging were placed alongside the body, not as possessions to cling to, but as companions for the journey. Just as a traveler would not set out across the plains without provisions, so the soul was given what it needed for its passage into the spirit world. Each object carried meaning, both practical and symbolic, reflecting the life and identity of the one who had passed. The wind itself played a role in these ceremonies. On the open plains, where the landscape offers little barrier, wind is a constant presence, gentle at times, fierce at others. It was often seen as a messenger carrying prayers and songs across the horizon. When mourners sang skyward songs, their voices mingled with the wind, as if the air itself carried the melody to the spirit world. In moments of stillness, when the wind paused, silence took on deep meaning. It was not emptiness, but a breath, held, a pause between drum beats, an opening through which the soul could pass. Grief was never private alone. Funerals were communal acts, binding families and tribes in solidarity. Feasts were sometimes held after the burial, food shared in memory of the departed, and in gratitude to the spirits. Storytelling, too, was part of mourning. By recounting the deeds, humor, and wisdom of the deceased, people ensured that their presence lingered not only in memory but in the living fabric of the community. These stories, told by firelight or beneath the wide skies, reminded the people that death did not erase a life. It wove it into the collective spirit of the tribe. The spiritual beliefs of the plains tribes emphasized cycles of seasons, of life and death, of day and night. Death, in this worldview, was not a rupture, but a turning, a continuation of the great circle. The soul journeyed into another stage, one as real as the grass beneath one's feet or the stars above one's head. In this sense, funeral ceremonies were less about endings than about safe passages. The rituals gave direction, ensuring that the soul would not wander, but would find its way into the company of ancestors and spirits who awaited it. Colonial expansion, missionary presence, and forced assimilation disrupted many of these traditions. The building of missions, the spread of Christianity, and later the policies of government boarding schools sought to suppress native spiritual practices. Yet many funeral rites persisted, held quietly, or adapted to changing times. Even today, among plains tribes, prayer ties, drums, and songs continue to mark funerals, connecting modern lives with ancient rhythms. They carry the resilience of a people who, despite hardship, hold fast to the ways of honoring life and death. To stand on the plains and imagine such a ceremony is to sense its vastness. The fires glow under the open sky, the prayer ties swaying. In the wind, the steady drumbeat echoing across grasslands, each element worked together, speaking to forces larger than human sorrow. In these ceremonies, the living and the dead were bound not only to one another but to the land and sky that sheltered them all. And so the silence that followed, when songs were done and drums fell quiet, was not an emptiness, but a fullness. It was the hush of wind before it shifts, the stillness between heartbeats, the sacred pause in which the soul slipped beyond sight. One might wonder, when the last flame of the sacred fire dies down, does its smoke still linger, unseen, carrying the spirit into horizons no eye can follow? Chapter 19, Medieval Christian Rites and Bells of Passing. In medieval Europe, death was a passage not only of the body but of the soul, one carefully guided by ritual and sound. Within stone churches and village chapels, Christian funerary practices shaped how entire communities experienced loss. For the faithful, death was never an isolated event. It was part of a larger journey, one that wove the soul into the mysteries of heaven, purgatory, and the eternal order of God. The central act of a medieval Christian funeral was the Mass of the Dead, known as the Requiem Mass. This service was solemn, rooted in prayer and scripture, and deeply symbolic. Priests dressed in black vestments recited prayers commending the soul to God's mercy. Candles flickered around the coffin or bier, their flames representing both the fragility of life and the light of Christ, leading the departed into eternity. Incense rose in curling smoke, its fragrance sanctifying the space and symbolizing prayers lifting heavenward. For mourners, this layering of sound, scent, and ritual created an atmosphere where grief was tempered by hope. The tolling of bells played a profound role in these ceremonies. Church bells were not only instruments of timekeeping or summons, they were voices of the sacred, carrying their sound across villages and fields. When someone died, the bell was rung in a specific pattern, sometimes known as the passing bell. Its echo signaled to all who heard it that a soul had departed and that prayers were needed. The rhythm of the bell, measured and solemn, impressed upon listeners that death was both universal and near. For the medieval Christian, the bell's sound was not just a reminder of mortality, it was also reassurance, a call to prayer, and a sign that the church accompanied the soul on its journey. Burial itself followed a well-ordered pattern. The body, washed and wrapped in a shroud, was carried to consecrated ground, usually the churchyard. Graves were dug with care, aligned with the east, so that on the day of resurrection the dead might rise facing the rising sun, a symbol of Christ's return. Some were buried with simple wooden crosses, others with carved stone markers. The rich and powerful were often interred within church walls or beneath the floors of chapels, seeking proximity to the altar and the prayers that flowed daily within sacred space. But regardless of status, all were committed to the earth with words of blessing, earth to earth, ashes to ashes, dust to dust. For medieval people, the funeral was not an end but the beginning of a long dialogue with the dead. Prayers for the departed continued long after burial, often through anniversaries, masses, and offerings. The doctrine of purgatory, which became central in the medieval church, shaped this ongoing relationship. Souls, it was believed, did not always ascend directly to heaven, but passed through a state of purification. The prayers of the living could ease this passage, shortening the time of suffering and hastening entry into eternal rest. In this way, death tied communities together. Families, friends, and parishioners carried responsibility not only for their own salvation, but also for assisting those who had gone before. Monasteries played a central role in preserving and shaping these rites. Monks and nuns prayed daily for the dead, sometimes reciting entire psalters for the repose of souls. Wealthy patrons often endowed monasteries to secure such prayers for themselves after death, believing that the unbroken rhythm of monastic devotion could strengthen their hope for salvation. Within cloisters, chants echoed softly, their Latin, words binding heaven and earth in tones designed to calm, to console, and to uplift. Even the physical spaces of churches and churchyards reflected these beliefs. The graveyard was not only a place of mourning, but also of community gathering, markets, and daily life. The dead were not apart from the living, but remained among them, their presence sanctifying the ground beneath people's feet. Tombstones, carvings, and effigies reminded passers-by of mortality. Memento mori, remember you must die, was a quiet lesson inscribed in stone, urging the faithful to live with eternity in mind. Silence, too, played its role after the last bell faded. After prayers concluded and the grave was filled, a hush settled. This silence was not an emptiness, but a space of reflection. It was in the pauses between chants, in the moments after incense drifted away, that the mystery of death touched the soul most deeply. To those who stood there, the absence of sound could feel like the presence of something larger, a reminder that God's eternity stretched beyond the reach of human words. The medieval rites were as much about community as about the individual. Funerals drew neighbors, kin, and strangers together. Almsgiving often accompanied them, with bread and coins distributed to the poor in memory of the departed. Mourning was shared, grief was made collective, and remembrance was woven into acts of mercy. In these ways, the funeral did not end at the grave, but extended into the fabric of life, ensuring that death renewed bonds of compassion and faith. One might imagine the scene, a small stone church under a grey sky, its bell tower rising above clustered cottages. A procession winds slowly, carrying a wooden coffin draped in cloth. Candles flicker against the cool air. The bell tolls, each strike spreading outward across fields where farmers pause in their work to listen. Inside the church, incense drifts in beams of light, and Latin prayers rise in chant. The community gathers in silence, their faith binding them together, their hope resting on promises unseen. For medieval Christians, death was not only sorrow, but instruction. It reminded the living of their own destiny, their own need for preparation. The rites provided structure, reassurance, and meaning in the face of uncertainty. They allowed people to walk with the dead, to commend them into God's care, and to believe that no soul was abandoned. And when the last sound of the bell dissolved into the air, the silence that followed was itself part of the ritual. It was the space where grief softened into hope, where prayers gave way to trust, where the mystery of eternity whispered just beyond the reach of human hearing. One may wonder, in the stillness after the final toll, does the echo of the bell linger unseen, carrying the soul upward into the silence of God? Chapter 20, Jewish Mourning Rites and the Kaddish Prayer. In Jewish tradition, death is not met with grandeur or ornament, but with simplicity and dignity. The rituals surrounding burial and mourning are shaped by an ancient desire to honor the dead without distraction, while guiding the living into reflection, prayer, and community. Each act, from washing the body to the whispered recitation of prayers, carries meaning drawn from scripture and centuries of practice. Together, these rites form a bridge between the world of the living and the memory of those who have departed. At the heart of Jewish funerary customs is the burial itself. From early rabbinic law, the emphasis has always been on returning the body to the earth with humility. The book of Genesis reminds the faithful, "For dust you are, and to dust you shall return." This guiding principle ensured that burials were not lavish displays of wealth, but acts of reverence. The body, washed and dressed in simple white shrouds known as tachrikim, was laid within a plain wooden coffin, or in some communities, placed directly into the ground. These garments, identical for every person, symbolized equality before God. In death, no distinction remained between rich and poor, powerful or ordinary. The preparation of the body was itself a sacred duty. It was entrusted to members of the Shevra Kadisha, the Holy Burial Society, who performed the ritual washing known as tahara. This was done in silence and with prayer, an act of care for the deceased, but also of respect for the soul's journey. Those who carried out this work did so not for recognition, but as a quiet service, knowing that one day the same honor would be given to them. Burial was always swift, ideally within 24 hours of death, unless delayed by the Sabbath or unavoidable circumstances. This urgency reflected both a reverence for the body and a trust in divine timing. Graves were dug by hand, returning the dead to the earth in the most direct way possible. The moment of burial was marked with the recitation of prayers, but also with silence. Mourners themselves often placed shovelfuls of earth upon the coffin, each gesture heavy with meaning. The act was not symbolic alone. It was participatory, a way of embracing the finality of death while affirming one's duty to the departed. Once the burial concluded, attention turned to the living. Jewish mourning is structured through stages, beginning with Shiva, the 7 days immediately following burial. During this time, the family remains at home, sitting on low stools or the floor, refraining from work and receiving visitors who come to offer comfort. Mirrors may be covered, shoes removed, and ordinary routines set aside. The purpose of Shiva is to create a space where grief can be fully felt, where mourning is not rushed or hidden, but held communally. The recitation of the Kaddish prayer becomes central during this period. Despite being associated with mourning, the Kaddish does not speak of death at all. Instead, it is a sanctification of God's name, a declaration of faith, and a reaffirmation of life. Its words, repeated daily in synagogue and at the graveside, remind the mourner that grief is carried not in isolation, but within the rhythm of worship and community. To stand and recite the Kaddish is to join one's voice to countless generations, echoing a prayer that binds the living and the dead in continuity. The structure of mourning extends beyond Shiva. For 30 days, the family observes Shloshim, a lighter but still intentional period of remembrance. Certain activities, celebrations, music, or shaving, may be set aside, signaling that grief continues even as life resumes. For those mourning a parent, the Kaddish is traditionally recited for 11 months, reflecting both devotion and the belief in the power of prayer to honor and elevate the soul. Memory becomes an ongoing act, woven into daily life long after. The funeral has passed. Silence is woven throughout these customs, the quiet of a home during Shiva. The pause after a prayer is spoken, the hush of a graveside, where only the sound of earth striking wood is heard, all become part of the ritual language. Silence is not emptiness here. It is the weight of presence, of grief held in reverence, of faith waiting patiently for words that cannot be spoken. The Kaddish itself is often described as a paradox. How can a mourner burdened by loss stand to proclaim God's greatness and the hope of peace? Yet it is this very paradox that gives the prayer its power. It teaches that even in sorrow one can find strength in continuity. Even in absence there is sanctification. To speak the Kaddish is to affirm that life, though shadowed by death, still holds meaning within God's creation. In medieval Jewish communities, as in modern ones, these practices bound people together. They were not rituals carried out by priests alone, but by families, neighbors, and entire congregations. Everyone bore responsibility for remembrance. Everyone carried the obligation to comfort. In this way, mourning was never solitary. It was an act of faith, but also of community, echoing the biblical commandment to love your neighbor as yourself. Jewish cemeteries themselves reflected this sense of continuity. Rows of modest stones marked the presence of those who had gone before. Small pebbles placed upon graves signaled visits and remembrance, a quiet gesture of presence that endured long after flowers had withered. Each stone was a testimony that memory persists, that the living had not forgotten. To imagine such a scene is to feel the calm gravity of these rites. A small group gathers under the open sky. The coffin is lowered into the earth, prayers spoken in steady rhythm. A mourner takes up the shovel, drops of soil thudding softly against wood. Then comes the Kaddish, words rising not as a cry of despair, but as a steady thread of faith. When the final Amen falls into silence, the moment feels suspended, as if grief has been carried upward into something larger than itself. In this way, Jewish mourning holds together both sorrow and sanctification. It honors the reality of loss, without denying the mystery of hope. It roots the mourner in community while lifting the memory of the departed into eternal embrace. And perhaps it is in the silence, after the Kaddish has been spoken, after the earth has closed over the grave, that the deepest truth is felt. One may wonder, in that quiet, when prayer lingers unseen between the worlds of the living and the dead, does the soul hear the echo of those words, carried like a steady thread into eternity? Chapter 21. The Sacred Fire of Indigenous Australian Funerals. Across the vast Australian continent, Indigenous peoples developed funeral traditions deeply entwined with the land, the seasons, and the stories of creation. These rituals, though varied from region to region, shared a single thread. They did not separate death from life, nor soul from earth. Instead, they were acts of continuity, affirming that the person who had departed now returned to the eternal realm known as the dreaming or dream time. In many communities, the fire was central to these rites. Fire was not only a source of warmth and survival, but a bridge between the visible and the unseen, to burn a body or to pass belongings through. Flames was to free spirit from matter. It was also a way of ensuring that the essence of the deceased would not linger in unrest, but would join the great circle of ancestors. Fire carried smoke upward, a visible thread rising into the open sky, suggesting the soul's passage from earth to the realm of spirits. Other groups preferred burial, laying their loved ones within the ground, often in specific sacred places. Caves, sand dunes, or areas of great spiritual significance. Sometimes, bodies were painted with ochre, wrapped in bark, or positioned with care. Each of these choices reflected not just practical need, but a symbolic geography. The land itself was alive with ancestral presence, and by returning the body to it, one ensured that the cycle of belonging remained unbroken. The smoking ceremony was another profound practice. Here, Green leaves or bark were burned, producing thick, fragrant smoke that washed through the space where the community gathered. This smoke cleansed the air, drove away harmful spirits, and prepared both the living and the departed for transition. Mourners might walk through the smoke, letting it cling to their bodies, so that grief itself could be softened and the boundary between worlds acknowledged. Silence played as important a role as fire or smoke. After chants and songlines had been offered, after stories of the deceased had been spoken aloud, there would come a stillness. In this quiet, the crackle of flames or the sigh of wind across the land became the only sound. This pause was not emptiness, it was a recognition of the sacred, a breath held between farewell and release. The dreaming gave context to all these rites. In indigenous belief, dreamtime was not merely a mythic past, but an eternal reality that shaped the present. Ancestors were always near, guiding, teaching, and sustaining the community through song and story. Death was not a severance, but a movement from the visible world into the timeless one. By following ritual, the community ensured that the soul found its path back into this realm, where it could join the lineage of spirits that watched over land and kin. Some traditions involved secondary burials where remains were placed upon a platform or left to weather, then later gathered and buried with ceremony. This twofold process reflected the understanding that the spirit's journey unfolded in stages, just as the body itself returned slowly to the earth. Mourning, too, unfolded in stages. Families might observe long periods of restriction, avoiding certain foods, places, or even the name of the deceased. These taboos created a rhythm of memory, ensuring that loss was not hidden away but woven gently into daily life. The ceremonies often included songlines, chants that mapped both land and spirit. These were not simply laments, they were living connections between people, ancestors, and country. To sing was to retrace the paths walked by creation beings, ensuring that the soul could follow them back. Each voice joined into a pattern far older than any individual life. Among some groups, mourners would paint themselves in white clay or ash, a visible sign of grief. This practice externalized sorrow, allowing the community to share in its weight. The body itself became a canvas of mourning, carrying the marks of loss as openly as the land carried the footprints of ancestral beings. What is striking in these customs is the absence of rigid uniformity. Indigenous Australia contained hundreds of language groups, each with its own landscape, its own dreaming stories, its own burial rites. Yet across this diversity, one can sense a shared truth: that death is not an interruption, but a return, not an end, but a rejoining with eternal presence. To imagine such a funeral is to picture a fire glowing against the night sky, its smoke rising as voices sing. The body rests in the care of kin, surrounded by chants, by the rhythm of clapsticks, by the slow hush of wind across the land. Then comes the silence, the moment when all words fall away, and only the crackle of fire remains. In that pause, it is as though the spirit itself is carried gently into the dreaming. These practices remind us that fire is not only destructive, but purifying. Smoke is not only haze, but prayer. Silence is not only absence, but presence. For Indigenous Australians, to care for the dead was also to care for the living, for land, and for the unseen bonds that knit the world together. One might ask, when the fire dims and the smoke drifts into the stars, does the land itself remember, holding the footsteps, the voice, the breath of those who have walked upon it? Chapter 22, Reflections, the silence that binds all rituals. Across deserts and mountains, along rivers and seas, beneath cathedrals and open skies, humanity has shaped countless ways of honoring the dead. Each culture devised its own language of farewell, some through fire, some through water, others with earth or air. Yet beneath all the diversity of form, there runs a quiet thread, unbroken across time and distance. The silence that follows, the rite, the pause that holds grief and reverence alike. Silence does not mean absence. In rituals of burial, cremation, or offering, silence has been the final gesture after words, after song, after the movement of hands and bodies. The tolling of bells in a medieval village eventually fades. The chanting of priests in temples drifts into stillness. The beating of funeral drums in Africa ceases, leaving the air vibrating with echoes. The smoke of indigenous fires thins and disappears into the wind. Always, the ritual closes with a quiet that lingers. This silence is more than rest. It is a form of listening. To pause is to admit that the mystery of death exceeds human words. Where stories end, silence begins. Where prayers reach their limits, silence continues them in another register. In this hush, communities across the world have felt the presence of ancestors, the nearness of gods, or the gentle release of the soul into unseen realms. Anthropologists often describe funerary rituals as bridges between worlds. The Aztecs placed turquoise, food, or dogs with the dead, believing these offerings eased the journey into the afterlife. Zoroastrians placed their departed in towers exposed to the sun and birds, trusting that the soul moved on toward eternal light. Christians lifted prayers heavenward while burying the body in consecrated soil. Inuit families, under the shimmer of the aurora, saw the northern lights as the path of souls. Each practice was distinct, yet each ended in a gesture that admitted, "There is more than we can see, more than we can hold." The silence that follows a ritual is therefore not an emptiness, but a fullness. It contains the weight of memory, the warmth of presence, and the recognition of loss. It gathers together what words and actions cannot fully capture. The living stand in that stillness, reminded that they too belong to this cycle of coming and going, arrival and departure. Perhaps this is why silence feels so natural in these moments. To speak endlessly would be to resist the truth of mortality. To fill the space with sound would be to avoid the reality that life yields to mystery. Silence allows that yielding. It softens the sharp edges of grief and opens a path toward acceptance. In the Australian outback, a smoking ceremony leaves behind only the faint smell of eucalyptus in the air. In Japan, the great mounds of kofun rest beneath the weight of centuries, their grass-covered forms undisturbed by time. In the plains of North America, the wind moves across sacred fires, carrying away the last strands of smoke. Each scene is different, but each holds the same quiet moment. The breath after the ritual is done, when both living and dead seem held in the same embrace. Even in traditions filled with sound, chants, bells, drums, silence still arrives, at the end like the closing of a circle. One could say that every ritual, no matter how elaborate, is only preparing for that silence. The offerings, the words, the movements all culminate in a stillness where the mystery is finally entrusted to something beyond human hand. It is striking that in so many languages, words for death carry associations with rest, sleep, or stillness. To die is to lay down, to become quiet, to enter into peace. Funerary rituals make this symbolic truth tangible. They guide the living into silence, so that grief may soften and the memory of the departed may settle gently into the community's
heart. And what of those who remain?
For them, silence is also a teacher. It invites reflection on the nature of life itself. Why do humans across every era feel compelled to mark the moment of death with care and ceremony? Why not simply let life end unnoticed? Perhaps it is because the silence of death is too vast to face alone. Rituals frame that silence, giving it structure, rhythm, and meaning. They transform emptiness into remembrance. In this way, silence is not only the end of ritual, but its purpose. To sit in stillness after a farewell is to acknowledge both the fragility and the sacredness of existence. It is to recognize that life is part of something greater, something that words, songs, and offerings can only point toward. One might picture a universal scene, people gathered in a circle, whether around a fire, within a church, beside a
river, or under the stars. They sing, they pray, they chant, they speak, and then, as if by instinct, they grow quiet. In that quiet, their hearts align.
In that quiet, the boundary between the seen and the unseen feels thinner, more permeable. This silence binds all rituals because it is the one element that does not belong to any single culture. It is not shaped by geography or doctrine. It is the shared inheritance of humanity itself. To be silent at the end of a ritual is to stand before mystery with humility. It is to say, we do not fully know, but we honor. As the long arc of history shows, people have used fire, water, stone, and sky to guide their dead. Yet in the end, the bridges they built always led into silence. That silence is not an ending, but a continuation, like the pause between heartbeats or the breath between words. And so, across every land and age, funeral rituals reveal a shared truth. Humanity reveres the passage of life into mystery, not by conquering it with words, but by bowing to it in stillness. The silence that follows, whether beneath bells, drums, or stars, is the true hymn of remembrance. Perhaps this is why silence feels eternal. It holds the voices of the past, the grief of the present, and the hope of what lies beyond.
And in that eternal hush, the living too find rest. When all the rituals are done, when the last chant has faded, when the smoke has thinned and the waves have stilled, silence remains. It is the thread that binds generations, the breath that
links the living with the dead, the quiet that cradles both grief and love. One might wonder, in that silence, do we not also hear the faint rhythm of eternity itself?